Okay, we move on to the next item of business. It's item number 136 under private members' business. It's motion re Cannabis Regulation. I call on Deputy Luke Ming Flannagan to move the motion, and you've 40 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sharing time with, who am I sharing time with? I'm sharing time with Catherine Murphy.
Can I read out what the...
Yeah, I think that'd make a lot more sense.
Yeah. You're designated 18 minutes. Richard Boyd Barrett, Deputy Richard Boyd, 5 minutes. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan, 5 minutes. Deputy Thomas Pringle, 5 minutes. Deputy Matty McGrath, 5 minutes. And Deputy Michael Healy-Rae, 2 minutes. Is that agreed?
Yeah. Okay. First off, I want to formally propose the motion on the legalisation of cannabis. And the first thing I want to say is I just want to thank a few people who have helped me out on this. Dr. Cathal O'Sullivan, who's a member of the board of Normal Ireland, as is Stuart Clark, Dr. Gareth McGovern, Patrick Fitzpatrick, and to all the other people who have helped us out on this. Now, a couple of weeks ago, when I raised this issue, one of the first things that was said to me by people in the media was, this isn't really that important. So one of those media organisations, I decided I would search how many times they use the word cannabis on their website. And the figure of 3,200 came up. Now, one would imagine if it wasn't important, then they wouldn't mention it that often, given the fact that they also mentioned the word troika on 2,200 occasions. So if it's not important, I'd love to know why they're obsessed with writing about it. I'm advocating its control, standardization, legitimization, and taxation. I am recognizing the fact that it is freely available. Not my words, but the words of Deputy Emmett Stagg from the Labour Party. I have to say I agree with them, 100%. The idea that this is a radical idea anymore doesn't run. It is not radical anymore to say that cannabis should be legalized. And one of the major pointers towards that is a Gallup poll which was done in the United States of America in the last week, which showed that 58% of correspondents said that they thought it should be legal. Last year, that figure was 48%. We have seen a turning point on this issue around the world. On the journal.ie website, a poll was commissioned over the last week, and over 80% of the people who took part in the poll agreed that cannabis should be legalized. Now, the percentage in favour isn't the only remarkable thing. The other remarkable thing is the amount of people who participated in the poll, over 40,000 people. Now, I have to say, I found it a little ironic when some people who opposed the legalisation of cannabis rubbished this poll on the basis that people who smoked cannabis or used cannabis were more motivated to vote in this poll. I find that interesting, really, given that the same people say that people who use cannabis suffer from motivation problems. That's a bit strange then, because if they are actually correct, then the figure is higher than 80%. When one scans the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, and the Journal website, when you look at articles about this discussion, one discovers that the people of Ireland are actually ready for legalisation. I wouldn't be that confident that the members of Dáil Éireann are ready for it, but then again, it wouldn't be the first time that we were a little bit slow when it came to realising what the public wanted. On these three publications, there were over 1,000 comments. And from my understanding of it and my reading of it, there were less than 50 of them who were against it. So we have a situation now where an issue is described as radical by many people in Dáil Éireann, yet the vast majority of the public seem to be on board with it. Now, it doesn't end there. All one needs to do is have a look at Deputy Joe Carey's Facebook page, where I have to say, with great credit to him, he put out the question, what do you think of this bill? And he could have left it. He could have avoided the question, and he didn't, and I congratulate him for that. Now, I wonder, was he surprised at the reaction that he got? Because I have to say, I was surprised. I have been surprised in the last 2 weeks. I was expecting to get a political beating up at home for this, because I didn't think it would be that popular, but so be it. But if one looks at Deputy Joe Carey's Facebook page, and I'm increasing his likes as the seconds go by, one will discover that there are over 200, maybe 230 comments at this stage, and the vast majority of them are in favour of legalising cannabis. Deputy Carey tells his Facebook followers that he will listen. I hope he does. Normal Ireland, which was launched this week in Buzzwells, is more proof that this debate is going mainstream. Normal Ireland has 2 members on its board who are practicing GPs with years of experience in addiction treatment. We also have a journalist, Stuart Clark, who was on board on this, a man who doesn't use cannabis and has no interest in it. Further proof that this debate is going mainstream is that Tom Lloyd, former head of Cambridgeshire Police Force, has travelled to Ireland twice in the last week to support this bill. However, I have to say, I was a little surprised when listening to him on my local radio station, where he described me as being a little bit conservative for his liking when it came to this bill. This man spent his whole life trying to prevent people getting cannabis and other illegal substances, and at this stage, the penny has dropped. It doesn't work. He works in the area, he worked in Scotland Yard for several years, and he accepts it doesn't work anymore. Now, if ever you wanted proof that it isn't radical, listen to this. The Irish Labour Party discussed whether to decriminalise or legalise cannabis at its annual convention in November 2007, but deferred the matter to its national executive for further discussion. Putting cannabis on the party agenda was the handiwork of the party whip, Deputy Emmett Stagg, who has long been a prominent proponent of legalisation. And I will paraphrase him, or quote him. Ireland has some of the highest cannabis usage rates in Europe, Stagg noted. He does not wish to encourage cannabis use, he said, and I'll repeat what I said earlier, only to regularise a drug that is readily available across the country. Leaving the weed illegal, creates criminality and drives young people into the hands of drug dealers. Couldn't agree with him more. Well said. He also said, I'm advocating its control, standardisation, legitimisation and taxation. Now, it gets better, actually. But after the contentious debate, the party voted to defer a decision, kicking that can down the road again, you're good at that, on adopting legalisation or decriminalisation as part of the platform. By a narrow margin, and following the lead of former party leader Pat Rabbitte, looking forward to hear what he has to say about this, delegates voted to refer the matter to the National Executive for further discussion. While Rabbitte, according to the quote, Deputy Rabbitte, properly pronounced, urged caution at the conference, he did say that policymakers need to be thinking outside the box when it comes to cannabis. Well, he'd be very pleased then, no doubt, to hear that I have brought this debate here, and maybe he will participate in it. Now, more proof, if ever you need it, that it is not a radical suggestion to call for the legalisation of cannabis, is the fact that a country called the USA, you probably know them, Enda Kenny loves the country, thinks it's a wonderful place. Posteriors regularly get kissed when he visits the place. So obviously he'd agree with some of their policies. In the US, in the last year, they have legalized cannabis in Colorado and Washington. Washington, imagine, in Washington, in the US of A. So we'll be expecting the Taoiseach now to follow suit anytime, because he always thinks they're right. The amazing thing about the legalization that took place in Colorado and Washington was the fact that it was not followed up by any sanctions from the federal government. I had expected this. People in Colorado and Washington had expected it, but it didn't happen. Because guess what? The penny has also dropped with Barack Obama. And you know what? I find it bizarre that it just took so long, given that he was a regular user when he was younger, and he was quite open about that fact. But it has changed things. Several other states are set to follow suit. In fact, today, in Portland, Oregon, there is a plebiscite on legalizing cannabis in the city. God forbid you'd have the confidence in the general public to make those decisions for themselves. It's a pity you don't, because I think they've made the decision. Uruguay have now legalized, and many South and Central American countries, including Mexico, are also looking at the possibility. I do not believe what happened in Uruguay would have happened but for the fact that it had previously happened in the United States of America. Because remember, they are the nation with the big stick or the guns or the drones or whatever they want to hit you with. And when they, the people with the big stick, decided it was all right, then a country like Uruguay felt it was okay to follow suit. I think it would have happened beforehand if the United States had gone down that road earlier. Now to Europe. In Holland, as everyone already knows, it is currently decriminalized. In the last week, however, there have been comments made by senior politicians pointing towards outright legalization. Now, the situation in Holland is not that clear to many people in Ireland. And there's a reason why. Because about a year ago, the Irish media, that wonderful group of people, reported that they were going to ban foreigners from going into coffee shops in Holland, and that people would have to join clubs to participate. Now, that was widely reported, all right, but what wasn't widely reported is that that was never implemented. And to this day, I talk to people who say, Ara, how could you legalize cannabis? Sure, aren't they going backwards in Holland? Well, they're not. Check the facts, anything but. Now, in Australia, do you think they have such penal sanctions as they do in Ireland? No, they don't. Cannabis has been decriminalized for personal use in small amounts in the Australian Capital Territory, South Australia, Western Australia, and the Northern Territory. In Belgium, the possession and cultivation of very small quantities, 3 grams or 1 female plant, respectively, are illegal, all right, but they are tolerated. In the Czech Republic, a similar situation pertains, except for the amount is higher. 15 grams, and the cultivation of up to 5 plants is now considered only a misdemeanor. In Germany, the most hard-working people in Europe, well, I hope they are, they keep telling us they are anyway, the amount of personal use for cannabis possession varies in legality depending on state, with Berlin being the most accommodating at 15 grams. Now, the German economy is doing quite well. They haven't all become apathetic or demotivated. In fact, quite the opposite. In Spain, and in particular in Barcelona, one can join a cannabis social club and legally purchase not-for-profit cannabis once one is a member of a club. So it's not radical to suggest we should legalize cannabis. In fact, if you look at the real meaning of the word radical, the fact that 58% of people in the United States of America want it legal, it actually means it's actually slightly conservative. So that should really go down well with Fine Gael anyways. So what should we do? Well, the government needs to regulate. The purpose of this motion is to ask the government to do so. If it does not, then on Thursday, I will introduce my own bill to the House at first stage called the Cannabis Regulation Bill, and we'll start all over again. The purpose of the bill would be to provide for the regulation of cannabis for recreational and medicinal use. It would lead to the creation of a Cannabis Regulation Authority, which would be set up by the Minister for Justice. Now, bad and all as he is, he'd definitely be better than John Gilligan at administering this, to regulate cultivation, sale, labelling, advertising and marketing of cannabis. It would provide for a licensing system for commercial, home and cannabis social club cultivation to be controlled by the Cannabis Regulation Authority. A Cannabis Research Institute would be established by the Minister to conduct or commission research in respect of cannabis, along with educating the public on its effects. The bill would allow for the provision of a licence for home cultivation of cannabis. The maximum allowable number of plants would be six female plants. Personal possession of up to 1 ounce, 28.35 grams, would be allowed under the bill if passed into law. This is in the case of an individual who would not possess a grower's license. Although I have to say, we're so dominated by Europe, you'd probably shoot it down on the basis that I used an imperial measurement. So I'd be quite happy if you go with the grams. The Cannabis Social Club model would be introduced, which supplies members with not-for-profit cannabis in a community setting. In other words, a grower would be able to grow for up to 50 people and grow 300 plants. Now, some people might say, sure, why wouldn't you grow them yourself? Well, no more than alcohol isn't that difficult to brew. People still don't do it. People like convenience. Also, under the provisions of the bill, licenses would be granted for the sale of cannabis, including a cannabis wholesale license, cannabis retail store license, medicinal cannabis retail license, cannabis coffee shop license, and a cannabis social club license. Under this bill, no children would be allowed on the premises relating to cannabis. It would remain an offence for children to possess cannabis. And this actually brings up an issue. In this debate, I am no longer having the discussion as to whether cannabis should be legalized or not. It now seems to have moved on to how we would legalize it. And in that sense, many people have said to me, is it a good idea to criminalize children? Does it help? That is an area that needs to be looked at. Under this proposed bill, advertising would be stricter than current alcohol advertising. In fact, advertising in sport would be strictly prohibited. And that is consistent with my opinion on advertising any mind-altering substance with sport, whether that be alcohol, caffeine, or anything else for that matter. Under this bill, it would be a requirement for the Minister for Justice to look at the agricultural benefits of the use of hemp. And also the Minister for Agriculture could look at this. And actually, the outfit I'm wearing now is made from hemp. And we could be growing this stuff and we could be developing an industry around it.
Just 1 minute remaining.
Under the Cannabis Regulation Bill 2013, the Cannabis Regulation Authority shall be accountable to Dáil select committees. Now let's compare that to now. Who is John Gilligan accountable to? Who is Nidge out of love-hate responsible to? He's certainly not accountable to Dáil select committees. I'll finish by saying, over the next 2 days of debate, I look forward to hearing the views of other deputies, especially those deputies who have in the past admitted to using cannabis. It will be very interesting indeed to see whether these people believe they should have a criminal record or not. Such a criminal record has dire consequences for the individual. Over 100,000 people currently have a criminal record for possession of cannabis in Ireland. These people are denied the right to a decent job because if they fill out the application form truthfully, they will be refused. One can never be a teacher, a doctor, a childcare worker, etc. So I have a warning for those who think it's all right to have a criminal record imposed on people for using cannabis, while at the same time not getting one themselves. I will, after this debate, be contacting the Garda Síochána to inform them of the particular deputies' past actions. So think carefully before you criminalise others. Thank you.
An alcohol deputy Richard Boyd Barrett. 5 minutes.
Thanks, Ciara. I'd like to commend Deputy Luke Flannagan for putting this motion forward and for the tremendous work he's done on the bill that he's drawn up and which he's likely to be presenting to this House in the next few days. He deserves our commendation for having the political courage and determination to take up an issue that probably even those who privately agree with him, or some publicly, probably would not have chosen to bring here before the Dáil and to really fight the case out and the issue out publicly in this way. And that shows, to my mind, considerable political courage and principle. And I hope that the government will take the issue seriously in the debate and engage properly in the debate. And I would say that the onus is on the government to make a case against what Deputy Flannagan is suggesting, and those who argue that we should either decriminalise or legalise cannabis. Because to be honest, I just don't see what the argument is for maintaining criminalisation of cannabis use. I just don't see what case can be put forward. I suppose the case, although I'd be interested to hear what the government have to say, or the opponents of this motion and the bill would say, would have something to do with health. But let's just put a simple fact on the record of the Dáil. There has never been a death in Ireland attributable to cannabis use. Not one. Not a single one. Now, of what are called drugs, a somewhat broad catch-all and almost meaningless term, but of what you might put under the banner of the label drugs, virtually every other one, we do have deaths, many of them attributable to the use of those things. Deaths, we know, as a result of the smoking of cigarettes, thousands of them. Deaths as a result of the abuse of alcohol, excessive use of alcohol, not to mention family violence, relationship breakup, violence in the community, and so on. Deaths on the road. Many, many deaths we know about. We know that prescription drugs can potentially be very, very dangerous. And there are very serious question marks over antidepressants, the long-term use of them, even though these are prescribed regularly to thousands and thousands of people. Painkillers, which can be bought over the counter, but which can potentially have very serious adverse effects for people's health. Cannabis, on the other hand, of all of those things, under that general heading, has not been responsible for a single death. Now, that's not to say cannabis is always and everywhere good for you.
1 minute remaining. No, make the one.
Although it is clear that there are medicinal uses for it, but it is to say, of all the things that are loosely called drugs, the least harmful of them is cannabis. And if a government is going to be consistent in how it deals with what is called the drugs issue, then unless you are going to ban all of those other things, ban alcohol, ban cigarettes, ban antidepressant drugs, you can't really sustain a position of keeping cannabis use criminal. And of course, the only, the biggest adverse impact of cannabis use relates to the fact that it is criminalized, because it pushes cannabis users and producers into the criminal world, which they otherwise would not be. Insofar as there are damaging, worrying social impacts of cannabis use, they are almost exclusively and solely to do with the fact that it is illegal and the consequences of that. And of course, we know how prohibition of alcohol in the 1930s spawned the growth of the mafia, with all the damage that did to American society for decades. Afterwards, it seems to me obvious the same applies here. So I would like to hear what the government have to say, but it seems to me at the very least they should accept this motion and let Deputy Flanagan's bill pass to the next stage so we can have a serious adult discussion about this important social issue.
Can Corley. Capan goil sé réicteach agus táhachtach go bhfuil an díospóireacht seo ag tosnú inocht. But I see it, and I want to first to acknowledge Deputy Flanagan's his work on this and his passion on this topic. But I see it as part of a much, much wider debate, and I think tonight should be the start of that bigger debate, which will look at drugs and alcohol and addiction and treatment and prevention and education. We'll look at health, we'll look at crime, we'll look at harm reduction, we'll look at the whole decriminalising aspect. I do think that the legalising aspect is a much more complex area. I think starting the debate is vital. In 2009, the Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy, they called for the international community to break the taboo on this. And that was echoed in the 2011 Global Commission on Drug Policies, again calling for an open debate. And I think also driving that fact is the fact that in 2016, the United Nations General Assembly special session will be holding one on drugs and drug policy. And I think Ireland has to be ready for that. And part of that will be a systematic, independent, objective evaluation of our drug strategy and the views of people in this country to drugs. And I hope tonight is the start of that debate. But it's a debate that has to be honest, and it's a debate that also has to be based on evidence, and evidence that comes from quality research. Now, when I looked at Deputy Flanagan's bill, my reaction was, it's innocuous, it's very mild. There's a very strict set of guidelines. They're even stricter than the guidelines for alcohol. It's taking the control of the cannabis market out of the hands of the criminals, and it's not a free-for-all. And the emails tell us that there are 150,000 people who use cannabis in this way, and I think we probably got emails from practically all of them at this point. But the point that's also borne out by research, the survey done on drug prevalence by the National Advisory Committee on Drugs 2010 and 2011, is that these people, they're adult, they're educated, they're generally middle class. They are an informed group of people who can make choices and decisions very rationally. And I can see why there is support for that. And if it was followed in that particular way, I too could support it. But I'm coming from a constituency, parts of which have suffered more than any other part of Ireland from drugs. And I can't divorce what's happening in this bill from what I see around me in that constituency. The drug takers in my constituency are a particular cohort. They're young male, they're early school leavers, they have a poor employment record, many come from dysfunctional families, and they are not in a position to make rational and informed decisions about their drugs of choice. My views come from that background. They come from the fact that I chair the North Inner City Drugs Task Force. I chair the group for the Young People's Facilities and Services Fund, which is looking at targeted response to those communities that are most at risk of drug addiction and misuse. And it also comes from my active involvement with the projects that are working on the ground with those in addiction and with their families. Now, what we're seeing in the inner city is a different type of cannabis from what Deputy Flanagan described. And it's a cannabis that's being used very considerably by an under 18-year-old cohort. It has a very, very different strength. It's being grown in the skunk factories. The chemical makeup is completely different from what Deputy Flanagan describes. And there are projects in the inner city now at the moment who are seeing the negative impacts on that, on the mental health of these young people and on their behaviour. I do acknowledge that some of it is being taken in conjunction with alcohol and tablets. But the pressure on some of these projects, particularly the one that is working with under 18s, is to find a cannabis detox because of its strength. And also because of its strength, it is a gateway drug to the other drugs, to the tablets and to the cocaine and heroin. This bill is for over 18s, and I think one of the unintended consequences is that the under 18s become a further target and increased targeting of them. Citywide Drugs Campaign had a question recently at their conference, can we take any more in relation to drugs? And the answer was no. And there is an active campaign going on that will put the drugs crisis, a political and public priority. And again, I have to make the point that it's the community and the voluntary sector who are most active with people in addiction, and they are seeing very considerable cuts. I'd like to see us looking at the decriminalising aspect and to stop using prison to tackle the drug issue. Most drug users don't commit crimes except the crime of possession, but that's not to deny the link between cocaine, crystal meth and heroin with crime. I think that the decriminalising debate is one that has to follow from this one here. We saw in Portugal what it has led to, the reduction in drug-related deaths, no increase in drug prevalence, but they also put more resources into the rehab and treatment. Alcohol, devastating effects, I don't undermine that for 1 minute, and the misuse is far more costly than any other particular drug. And I think the debate on drugs has to take that into account. Also, safer injecting rooms for those who are injecting. It has to take the methadone protocol into account as well. There are massive issues with that. The drug abuse began in the inner city. Nobody acknowledged it, nobody addressed it, and nobody addressed the social conditions out of which it came. And I just feel that for myself, I can't look at this debate separate from that bigger debate. And of course, following in the footsteps of the late Tony Gregory and the work that he did, it's the start of a debate, and I hope it continues in an open way.
Chuck the Thomas Pringle. Go ignore.
Thank you very much, Ross. And I would like to take this opportunity at the start of my contribution just to commend Deputy Flannagan for bringing forward his private member's motion tonight. I think it'd probably be right to say that this is the reason why Deputy Flannagan got involved in politics, or one of the many reasons that in the past that he has said himself, and he believes passionately in the need to legalise cannabis to, I think, improve not only the availability and choice for people who wish to use cannabis, but also the safety and the addiction problems that may be associated with as well, to have it in a structured and targeted way that it can be tackled and prevented as well. And I think it's a very important debate. I think it's a debate that we should have, and and I welcome the fact that we're having it tonight, and I hope it continues. Certainly, I do believe that we should be decriminalising cannabis as a minimum step and as a first step along the road in this debate, because I do think, and it has been mentioned already, that the evidence coming out from Portugal in relation to how they decriminalised drug use for personal use there has had an impact in reducing addiction levels and reducing the amount of drug-related deaths as well. So I think that is something that we should debate, and we should discuss, and we should certainly move to decriminalise. I think the debate in relation to cannabis and the regulation of cannabis is something that maybe I think the public are ready for it, and I think it's something that we should talk out and we should really discuss. Because I do believe if we can devise a system that would effectively control the strength, the distribution, and provide for education around addiction and around misuse, that would be something that would be worthwhile if it comes out of this legislation. Because I think that's something that we need to address, and we need to make sure that if we do regulate cannabis, that it's regulated in such a way that we can control it, and that's vitally important. I think if we were having this debate about alcohol and we were looking at regulating alcohol today, we certainly wouldn't regulate it in the way that it has evolved over the last couple of thousand years that alcohol has been used in society. So I think we would have a debate that would be very different, and we'd be looking at alcohol in a very different way. And I think when we look at the addiction that's caused and the toll that alcohol addiction has across society, I think we have to be very careful about unintended consequences and the possibility that if we did regulate cannabis and cannabis use, that we could open up an addiction problem as well, and something that we have to debate with, because there's no doubt that alcohol addiction is causing huge problems across society. And personal experience, and I think every family in Ireland has personal experience of alcohol addiction and alcohol abuse, and knows that the havoc that can wreak. Now, I don't believe, and I don't think that cannabis addiction could be as severe, or would be as severe if it was regulated properly from the very start. But it is interesting, in the National Advisory Committee on Drugs and Alcohol's bulletin in 2013, they said that 9% of recent cannabis users were classified as dependent on cannabis. Now, that's based on 3%, I think 3% of the population who are regular users, so it's quite a low figure, but that could be because of the difficulty in accessing cannabis and accessing cannabis for use. Like I said, I think if we can control it, and if we can devise a system that will allow cannabis to be controlled effectively, and provide education around the use and misuse of cannabis as well, this is a piece of legislation that could be very worthwhile and something that we need to look at. And I think we also have to look at the fact, as has been outlined already, that prohibition hasn't worked, it won't work, and it never will work.
and having prohibition for cannabis, we have no control over the strength of cannabis that's available on the streets to our young people, and that is a very serious problem. I know in Holland recently they're talking about controlling the strength of cannabis available in the coffee shops so that it won't be any more than 15% of THCs. And I think that's something that if we regulated it here in this country, we could definitely control the cannabis to be at lower rates of concentration, and I think that's something that would be worth considering as well. Overall, I believe that we probably have to tackle this issue, and we do, at the very least, have to decriminalise cannabis, and I think we should be looking very seriously at regulation and control, but in a way that we can get it right. Thank you.
Come on with Chuck the Matthew McGrath.
Welcome to the opportunity to speak on this bill. I think it's important that we debate such issues as the criminal or legalised use of currently banned substances like cannabis. I think it's time that we had a mature debate, and I do compliment Deputy Flannagan on bringing forward this proposal at this time, in spite of the fact that I have told him privately some weeks ago that I am opposed to it. But certainly I do commend the fact that he's bringing it forward for debate. The proportion of adults who reported using cannabis at some point in their lives ever used increased from 17% in 2002-03 to 22% in 2006-07. And also the proportion of young adults who reported using cannabis in their lifetime also increased from 24% in 2002-03 to 29% in 2006 and 2007. And that is a steady increase, and we have to sit up and take note of those figures. There's nothing to suggest that the trend has decreased, and so it's socially important, as I said at the outset, that we have a national conversation on this issue. And that reason, I think, is important that we do debate it. There's also a very extensive international debate about the merits or otherwise of introducing legislation to decriminalise the use of cannabis. And we must be mindful of what happens in our own European Union and also in the wider world. Because we're never too far away today with modern technology and modern methods of transportation from issues. So we can't put our head in sand and, like the elephant, hope it goes away. It won't, because it is a new type of world that we're living in, and we know that it's ever penetrating. After reviewing some of the research in this area, I find myself unconvinced that legislating the use of cannabis is the right thing to do at this point in time. And I say that honestly, having looked, not extensively, but certainly looked as a parent of a family myself, and talking to the medical people and people especially involved in mental health area, because we have huge problems there as it is, and our system can't cope. And it's a pity that Minister Lynch has just left, because she finds herself responsible for that area. And indeed, I know Ministers here at the moment, and he's not covering that area, but nonetheless there's huge gaping losses in the mental health services to people, especially in rural Ireland. And I'm talking my own area in South Tipperary with the closure of St. Michael's in Clonmel. But from policing criminal and indeed mental health perspective, I think that on balance the argument is against making it more readily available at this point in time. Only a few weeks ago, and this is in deference to what my colleague Deputy Barrett said a few minutes ago, the Dublin Coroner's Court was told by consultant stroke physician Joseph Harbison how doctors in St. James's Hospital had seen 5 or 6 cases of young people having strokes following the use of herbal cannabis in the past 3 years. Remarkable. Dr. Harbison said that the heavy use of high-potency cannabis is putting young people at risk. The National Drug Treatment Centre tells us that although many people consider cannabis to be a relatively safe drug, but new research shows that long-term users can find it hard to control their use of the drug and may become addicted. And indeed, we've seen that with alcohol. Smoking cannabis increases the risk of heart disease and cancer, such as lung cancer, and may also affect fertility. Cannabis use may trigger schizophrenia in vulnerable people. And that's what I said with mental health and the lack of treatment and the loneliness out there and issues associated with mental health and the discussion around it today. I think that is not the right time, and there's too much pressures on. The time of already restricted spending on mental health services, I can find no way to justify the legalization of a substance which already causes grave mental health issues. And I think that it's a pity that this government, and indeed the last government I'm a member of, have failed to tackle the supermarkets and indeed the off licenses and the way that they are propagating drink out there. And the supermarket levy obviously have won out over the vintners levy, because at least in pubs, and I salute the vast majority of publicans who run their business properly, pay their wages and pay their rates and the taxes, and run a good institution. Unlike people now, recovering alcoholics and young people, go in for pan love on sliced pan, and there's drink in front of them in every supermarket. And it's not being regulated. I know, Minister, you agree with me, but in the last 2 budgets, the capping Cork, and I put this forward in 5 budgets proposal, that we have a tax on the capping is called now, but on the cheap availability, it's just everywhere in front of people. So if something similar was to happen with cannabis, there'd be no stopping what might happen.
Deputy Mike Leader.
Yeah, thank you very much. At the outset, I thank Deputy Luke Flannagan for allowing me some of his speaking time and the technical group. And just to say that I want to compliment people like Patrick Fitzpatrick, who works with him, on the excellent work that they have done in bringing this bill before the House. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that we are having this debate here tonight? Whichever side of the argument you're on, I believe it is a sincerely good thing that we are having the debate. I have to say that if the legislation that is being proposed, if the bill that is being proposed was just talking about people using cannabis for medicinal use and for people who are ill and under doctor's advice and strictly regulated, I would have no problem whatsoever with it. The problem I do have is when it would come for use, for personal use, and people growing it at home, I would have a problem with that, and I would have concerns over that. But I certainly would take grave exception to the fact that a Fine Gael TD last week said he accused the technical group of a cynical attempt and by the group facilitating Deputy Luke Flannagan in bringing this bill before the House tonight. That's a ridiculous statement for any person to make, because when you see a person being broad-minded like Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan, and even though while she may not support it, like myself, she agrees very much that we're having this debate. She welcomes the debate, as I do. And I certainly think that will we all be better off for the work that Deputy Luke Flannagan has done and his people in bringing this bill before the House? We certainly will be, because while this not may be accepted in the way that it is, there certainly would be good to come out of having the debate in the first instance, last count caller. And I really believe in that, and I think it is wrong for anybody to say that it is wrong to facilitate debate. That is what democracy is about. That's what politics is about. And I very much welcome the debate. And I know that an awful lot of work and sincere effort and research and people from abroad have come here to support Deputy Luke Flannagan and have given their expertise and their life's experiences, and that's to be most welcome, because we're all learning and we're all on a learning curve, and it is very important that we be open-minded and broad-minded about all subjects like this. And thank you.
I'll call in Minister of State, Deputy Alex White.
Last Concordia,
17 minutes.
I propose to share my time with Deputies McNamara, O'Reilly and Carey. I'll take 17 minutes, thank you. Last Concordia. Drug misuse continues to be one of the most significant challenges facing our country. It is highly destructive.
Prime Minister, just before you start, I think you were to propose the amendment.
Oh, yes, I was going to do that, but I'll do it now. If I may formally move the amendment.
Thank you.
Drug misuse is highly destructive, has devastating effects on individuals, relationships and families, and on communities and society in general. Cannabis is the most widely consumed illicit drug in Europe and in Ireland. There's a substantial body of clinical evidence documenting the health and social risks associated with the use of this drug. Government in Lascan Corla is strongly of the view that we should maintain the current system of strict controls and regulation of cannabis in Ireland. For that reason, we'd not be supporting Deputy Flanagan's motion, and I formally move the amendment. However, can I say, in case I don't have the opportunity to say so later, that I agree with what deputies opposite have said about the necessity and the importance of debating these questions, and I have absolutely no objection whatsoever to the people generally in the media, and most of all in the Oireachtas debating these issues, largely for the reasons actually that were outlined by Deputy O'Sullivan, if I may say so, earlier on in her contribution. The rationale for the government's position is set out in the National Drug Strategy, which aims to tackle problem drug use across the 5 pillars of supply reduction, prevention, treatment, rehabilitation and research. One of the principal objectives of the strategy is significantly to reduce access to all drugs, particularly those drugs that cause most harm to young people, and especially in those areas where misuse is most prevalent. The Drugs Prevalence Survey 2010-2011, carried out by the National Advisory Committee on Drugs, found that cannabis was the most commonly used illicit drug in Ireland. The survey found that trends in recent and current use had remained stable in comparison to a similar survey carried out in 06-07. However, the survey reported that lifetime prevalence of cannabis had risen to 25% by 2010-11, up 3.4 percentage points since 06-07. In his motion before the House this evening, Deputy Flannagan calls for legislation to regulate the cultivation, sale and possession of cannabis and cannabis products in Ireland. He has not tabled a bill, at least not at this stage, but rather has asked the House to call on the government to introduce legislation. It's not strictly at all true for Deputy Boyd Barrett to say that the motions that are before the House this evening have any bearing on a bill, because there is no bill at all before the House. As is well known, these issues are already covered under the Misuse of Drugs Acts 1977 to 1984. Under that Act and the regulations made thereunder, the cultivation, production, preparation, sale, supply, distribution and possession of cannabis is prohibited, except for the purposes of research and the growing of hemp. The government has no plans to alter or repeal the current strict legal controls on cannabis and cannabis products in Ireland. However, we do recognise the claims made in respect of the potential health benefits of cannabis-based medicinal products, such as Sativex, for patients suffering from certain conditions such as multiple sclerosis. Accordingly, while it is not government policy to legalise cannabis or its use, provision is being made for the availability of cannabis-based medicinal products by way of an amendment to the Misuse of Drugs regulations currently being finalised in my department. This follows on from the receipt and assessment by the Irish Medicines Board of a request for authorisation for such a product to be available on the Irish market. As Minister with responsibility for the National Drug Strategy, I maintain close contact with all of the statutory agencies, government departments and the community and voluntary organisations involved in addressing the problem of drug and alcohol misuse in Ireland. As I mentioned earlier, our work spans across the 5 different pillars. Each of these aspects is of critical importance. In this regard, I think it is important to say that while law enforcement through the criminal justice system is an essential element of our policy approach, as is the case internationally, we must also give close attention to the health and indeed the education dimensions of addressing drug misuse. I am well aware of the international debate on this question. Earlier this year in Ecuador, representing the Irish EU presidency, I co-chaired a conference held along with the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean dealing with the global drugs problem. There were, of course, differing perspectives there on many aspects of this extremely challenging issue, including on the subject of legalisation and decriminalisation, in particular of cannabis. It's important for any government to be aware of international debates and experiences, and we are no different than any other country in that regard. Cannabis, cannabis extracts, and cannabinoid substances such as THC, which are contained in cannabis, are subject to international controls in the 1961 United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the 1971 United Nations Convention on Psychotropic Substances. Ireland is a party to these international conventions and consequently has agreed to create and maintain offences for the supply and possession of controlled substances, including cannabis. The case is sometimes made, that criminalisation of drug use does not work, or even that it is counterproductive. As policymakers, we should always be prepared to listen to reasoned argument. However, there is a significant body of clinical evidence which demonstrates that cannabis misuse is detrimental to health. Physical and mental health risks are particularly associated with long-term or heavy use of cannabis by young people. In 2004, the National Advisory Committee on Drugs published a study entitled Overview of Scientific and Other Information on Cannabis, containing evidence that cannabis use is detrimental to health, and this has been backed up by other international research. The risks include increased chances of developing lung and throat cancer, mental health illnesses such as schizophrenia, increased frequency of seizures and epilepsy, and depression. It can also lead to other health problems such as cardiovascular effects in susceptible individuals. The smoke from herbal cannabis preparations contains all the same constituents, apart from nicotine, as tobacco smoke, including carbon monoxide, bronchial irritants, and cancer-stimulating agents. There are strong indications that people who are regular users of cannabis but not tobacco develop more symptoms of chronic bronchitis than do non-smokers. Of particular concern to me, and this was referred to by Deputy O'Sullivan, are the findings of a 2011 NACD study regarding the increased potency of THC in cannabis products in recent years. There is evidence in that cannabis produced in Ireland, which can be grown quickly, has a higher potency than imported varieties. The question of higher potency is also an issue for our UK neighbours, who saw it as a compelling factor leading to the reclassifying of cannabis in 2009, thereby increasing penalties associated with possession and supply. A central aim of the National Drug Strategy is to promote throughout society greater clarity, awareness and understanding of the dangers of drug misuse. The promotion of healthier lifestyle choices among young people is at the heart of substance misuse prevention. I cannot overstate the importance of the work we do to try to prevent young people from being involved in drug use in the first place, before it becomes an entrenched habit and a dysfunctional way of life. Making this drug available, even where subject to severe restrictions, could potentially lead to increased levels of experimentation with drugs by young people. This in turn could lead to increased long-term and sustained use, with the real risk of significant and adverse effect to the health of users. We need to learn also from our experience in relation to new psychoactive substances. We're all aware of the proliferation of head shops in Ireland in the late 2000s. The increase in recreational use of new psychoactive substances posed significant potential risk to users. The fact that these substances were legal, hence the name legal high, gave comfort to those people using them that they were not in breach of the law. Government acted swiftly and decisively through controlling approximately 260 substances, as well as through the enactment of the Criminal Justice Psychoactive Substances Act 2010, which made it an offence to sell, import, export or advertise psychoactive substances. These measures led to a sharp decrease in the number of head shops. Law enforcement work continues in order to control the availability of these substances through the internet and other means, but there's no doubt that reducing access plays a vital role in reducing usage. The NACD overview of new psychoactive substances refers to survey findings indicating a pattern of reduced use of new psychoactive substances among a subgroup who may be described as recreational users. It's likely that this pattern of usage reflects the impact of the May 2010 government ban on a range of substances. Accordingly, Éireann, if we were to legislate to allow for the cultivation, sale and possession of cannabis, we would be acting contrary to our core policy objective of reducing availability and access to harmful drugs. And it does not follow that legalisation of the kind being advocated would reduce the level of criminality associated with the illicit drugs market. Were cannabis to be legalised, it presumably would be very strongly regulated, possibly heavily priced, and with a much lower potency level. The illicit market would no doubt continue and provide a cheaper and stronger product. Consequently, any benefits such as those suggested by Deputy Flannagan must be set against the likely continued existence of an illicit and indeed criminal market. As I've already stated, Ireland is a party to international conventions on the control of illicit drugs. In this respect, the EU Justice and Home Affairs Council of Ministers adopted a resolution in 2004 requesting member states to take measures to discourage personal use of cannabis. So Ireland's position cannot be considered purely in our own national context. We cannot act in isolation. We must be conscious of the position in other EU states. It's worth noting also, Éireann, that we now have in this country a comprehensive government framework setting out a vision for a healthy Ireland and the actions we need to take in order to attain this vision. Our objective is to improve the health and well-being of the whole population, increasing the proportion of people who are healthy at all stages of life and protecting them from threats to health and well-being. We need to minimise all risk factors if individuals are to be supported and motivated to make healthier choices. And can I just say, by way of brief response to the contributions of the colleagues opposite, to repeat what I said already about the absolute propriety of our having a debate in this House on these issues. And I would like, in fact, us to be able to engage in the Oireachtas in debate across all of the various threats and issues and challenges that we have in the area of drugs and alcohol. I was recently delighted to see that the government was able to approve a set of proposals brought forward by me in relation to the area of alcohol, and that for the first time ever, we are now going to have a public health alcohol bill, which is the first time ever in this country we've addressed the issue of alcohol in public health legislation, including addressing, by the way, some of the issues Deputy McGrath raised some moments ago in respect of access in supermarkets and so on. There's absolutely no objection to debate. But what I would say with respect to Deputy Flannagan is that there really is no reality to, as it were, suggesting that legalisation of cannabis is not a radical proposal. Even if one agrees with his proposal, whether one agrees or disagrees with it, it is a radical proposal. And it simply is not credible to ignore completely the health evidence, as Deputy Flannagan did. Deputy Flannagan did not make any reference, of course, to the speech. I don't think the word health. He was talking earlier about doing word checks. I think if we did a word check in Deputy Flanagan's speech, we'd be unlikely to find the word health. And it's simply, there's no reality to having a debate. If we want to listen to each other, as I listened very carefully to Deputy Flannagan and certainly to Deputy O'Sullivan and others, we have to listen to each other. We have to have regard to what's happening internationally, absolutely. But we cannot exclude from the debate completely the very genuine and serious risks that exist to health and that have been, for example, set out in recent days in the context of this debate by a number of psychiatrists and other professionals working in this field. So let's not exclude any of the discussion. Let's not exclude any reasoned argument. And if we're going to be respect one another's point of view, let's listen to all of the arguments that are made on all sides, as it were, of the House. So I say that there's no reality, Elias Concordia, to the suggestion that there's no downside or there are no potential negative consequences arising from legalisation. It simply is not credible for Deputy Flannagan or anyone to suggest that. I know he has to put forward his argument with all the force that he can muster, but he has to have regard to the case that is against him and the case that is against legalisation, and that's there too. So let's have that kind of a debate by all means, but let's have regard to all of the evidence, let's have regard to all of the arguments, and let's not imagine that, that taking the kind of step that Deputy Flannagan is advocating here in his motion, not a bill, because I repeat, there's no bill here, in his motion wouldn't have negative consequences, because manifestly they would.
I now call Deputy Michael McNamara.
Thank you very much, Les Concordia. I'd like to commend Deputy Flannagan and the technical group for raising this issue and giving this House the opportunity to debate what I believe is a very important and increasingly important issue. I'd also like to thank the technical group for offering me speaking time when it appeared like I wouldn't be able to get time tonight as opposed to tomorrow when I'm due to travel to a meeting. Les Concordia, in 1996, a book called Rethinking the War on Drugs in Ireland was published by Cork University Press, hardly a revolutionary outfit. It was written by a former law lecturer of mine, so maybe I'm slightly biased, but I found it a rather convincing read. I thought a serious argument was raised. In the years since 1996, I would ask the Minister, what serious rethinking of the war on drugs in Ireland has taken place? Because with the greatest of respect to the government counter motion tonight, it would appear that there has been none. The war on drugs was declared by none other than Richard Nixon in 1971, and he said that the war would result in a drugs-free world. Well, now more than 40 years on, there's a growing movement to declare that war unwinnable. Not least because there are more drug users in every country in the world, and I dare say in every constituency in Ireland. 250 million worldwide is the UN estimate. Illicit drugs are now the third most valuable industry in the world, after food and oil, estimated to be worth $450 billion a year. All of it in the control of criminals. So whether it's in this city, this country, Colombia, the United States, Scariff, Innisdiamond or Clarecastle, or even Cootehill, it's in the hands of criminals. And we know that drugs are dangerous, Minister. That is indeed an argument that has to be taken seriously. Just as we know that alcohol is very dangerous, and nicotine and smoking is very serious. And I would commend you and Minister Riley for the initiatives that you have both proposed and, importantly, are putting into action to combat the use of alcohol, the misuse of alcohol, and the misuse of smoking in Ireland. 7,000 people in Ireland die from smoking-related disease every year. These deaths are preventable, but nevertheless they occur. Now, you raised the point that if you legalise drugs that you won't eradicate criminality from it. Well, of course you won't. I mean, just tonight a poaching still was broken up, I believe, in Deputy Riley's constituency. And indeed, I've no doubt that there are people selling illegal cigarettes across this city as we speak. But nevertheless, we are able to control nicotine. We're able to control the amount of nicotine that's sold, who it's sold to, by and large, and get a clear picture of the problem. We have no such clear picture in Ireland of drug use. We do know that drug use is increasing. The CEO of Merchants Quay Ireland revealed that the scale of the country's drug problem is increasing, and he said the spread of drug use outside of Dublin was also an ongoing trend with continued demand for our services at regional level. So that's 17 years after Rethinking the War on Drugs in Ireland was published. Drug use continues to increase in this country. Now, Minister, in 2006, the adult caution scheme was introduced, whereby Gardaí could grant an adult caution to somebody for a list of offences if they believed it was beneficial. Now, it was proposed that the possession of cannabis, not possession with intent to supply, but possession of cannabis be included in that. It just fell off the bottom of the list. Since then, additional offences have been added in which an adult caution can be issued, but still possession of cannabis isn't included. Now, I asked the Minister for Justice how many cases the Probation Act was applied for possession of cannabis in Ireland, and it would appear to be about 1,500 on average every year. Now, that's 1,500 people who are apprehended, a file is prepared, the Garda shows up in court, the accused is brought to court, and at the end of it all, it's the Probation Act is applied. Now, I would ask, is that a useful use of Garda resources in your constituency, in mine, Deputy Collins's or Deputy Flannagan's? I don't think it is. So I would urge the Minister to seriously consider, and the Minister for Justice, to consider adding possession of cannabis to the adult caution scheme. Now, that doesn't mean that a caution will always be applied, but if the Garda in question believes that that's the best course of action, then he can do so. And that was what was originally proposed by the Minister for Justice as far back as 2006. And the other thing I would urge, Minister, is that a serious examination, because I don't regrettably accept, while a serious body of work has been done by this government when it comes to alcohol abuse and smoking, I don't believe that the counter-motion reflects a serious consideration of the drug problem that we have in Ireland now. That a serious commission be established of senior policing experts, revenue officials, and doctors and people from the medical world to examine what would, and I agree with you, Minister, it is a radical proposal to legalise drugs, especially as we have sort of built ourselves into this war on drugs mentality. So it would be radical. But I would urge you, Minister, to set up a commission of senior Gardaí, senior revenue people, and senior policing experts worldwide, including maybe the UNODC and other organisations that work on this issue, to examine what would the effect, because countries, we are now out of kilter with Western Europe, with the majority of states in Western Europe, with how we treat possession of cannabis. And yes, cannabis is becoming more dangerous, because as you said yourself, the variants which can be grown profitably by criminals in Ireland are more dangerous than those which used to be imported into Ireland by other criminals. But criminals will do what's most profitable without any concern for what's beneficial. And I would urge you, Minister, to move beyond the war mentality, because I fear it is a war which cannot be won towards seeing what is a workable solution to the drugs problem across this state. Thank you.
And I'll call Deputy Joe Riley.
Yeah, thank you, Last Concorla. Might I at the outset join in commending and indeed applauding Deputy Flannagan for creating this, bringing this debate about. It's a worthwhile debate. It's very critical that we would have it and that would be in the House of Parliament here. I do agree with Deputy O'Sullivan that the debate should be broadened out, and that on this and on future occasions we have to look at the entire issues around the use of drugs, around giving young people the necessary self-esteem to deal with the problem, and around all of the safeguards there. We do need a broader debate, and I totally agree with that. I think before we legalise a narcotic, we would have to look at the implications, and we would have to look at the health implications and at all of the implications. And when I read the evidence available to me, and when I think about this, I think, with great respects to the proposal, and I think it's a worthy debate, but I do think that the balance of good and the greater good for society lies in the status quo. And I think the evidence supports that. For example, I would say that it needs, as I say, careful consideration, but the evidence is in that area. Now, for example, it can contribute, and I'll be citing studies, etc. later, but it can contribute to cognitive deficiencies, to dependency, to smoking-related health problems such as throat and lung cancer and respiratory problems. So there are a whole array of health issues They're unavoidable, and the evidence supports it. And I would submit later to you that the gateway factor is unavoidable also. It is thought to contribute also to mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and in some cases psychosis. Its effect on the mind, the effect of cannabis on the mind of the user, especially if the user is an adolescent, is what is most disconcerting. Studies from Bristol University have shown that there are high levels of cannabis use among adolescents who show signs of schizophrenia. The primary psychoactive ingredients of cannabis is known as THC. THC is known to have a significantly disruptive impact on the areas of the brain vital for memory and decision making. People who smoke the drug between 5 and 20 times a month have a 10% more such memory problems than non-users, empirically established. And those who smoke it more than 20 times a month have been found to be 20% more deficient. It heightens anxiety that the user may feel, and adolescents who use the drug are at a highly vulnerable age. And the point was made earlier that maybe the THC levels are greater because it's subterranean or it's illegal or it's underground. My submission would be, with great respects to the proposer and to the supporters, that it wouldn't be possible to police that, and that you would still have an underground dimension, and that even with legalization, you couldn't police THC levels, and the problem would remain. The brains of users are still very much at the developmental stage, particularly if they're young people, from a cognitive and social behavioural point of view. And the British Medical Journal has found that using cannabis in adolescence increases the likelihood of experiencing symptoms of schizophrenia in adulthood, and early cannabis use by age 15 or older confers greater risk of schizophrenia outcomes later.
1 minute.
Now, I'm aware of the issues around pain relief, and I'm happy that the department have conducted a study and are looking at its use in relation to multiple sclerosis. But again, Dr. Henry McKee from Oxford University has cautioned in this area about the side effects on the nervous system. But so the jury's out a little bit on that, but insofar as it's beneficial from a health point of view, any civilized person would want that to be the case. We talk about the nicotine, and I want last Concordla, with your indulgence, to very briefly mention a couple of things. We talk about the nicotine versus cannabis debate, and indeed alcohol. Nicotine, were it presented now, would be made illegal with the knowledge we have today. And our attitudes to alcohol are changing all the time and would be radically different. And I commend the fact that the Minister is going to deal with it. The very serious matter, last Concordla, is the gateway factor. And while it might sound old-fashioned a little and maybe traditional, I'm genuinely concerned about the gateway factor. And I say that as a teacher, as a parent of 3 young lads myself. I would genuinely be concerned there, because if you see the way the head shops were used until they were interfered with, and the degree of experimentation there, and the plethora of head shops that developed quickly, indicating use and indicating experimentation and indicating that they had an excitement. And I'm afraid that it would create the gateway culture, and the progression would go on. And there's support from the Yale Journal of Adolescent Health to suggest a use of prescription drugs by young people who use cannabis afterwards. Now, we set up, the Netherlands would be cited as nirvana as the classic example by proponents of the legislation, but there are some compelling, and I'm finishing on this last Concordla, some compelling and very difficult statistics from the Netherlands that we can't avoid. 13,109 clients entered treatment for cannabis use in 2011, and 48.3% of all treatment clients reported cannabis as their primary drugs. The Netherlands National Drug Monitor Annual Report 2011 states that in the period between 2007 and 2009, nearly 30,000 adults aged 18 to 64 were diagnosed with cannabis dependence.
To call your colleague,
so basically, and they have all the health issues arise there. So there are grave difficulties have arisen in the Netherlands. I say with great sincerity, and I'm finishing on this last Concordla, that I genuinely believe that there's a serious body of evidence around the mental health issues with continuous use, and B, there is a real gateway risk. And until we get compelling evidence to the contrary, and I wouldn't have a difficulty with studies of the kind cited by Deputy McNamara, but until we get compelling evidence to the contrary, I think we have to maintain the status quo.
Deputy Joe Carey.
In recent days, I've been asking for contributions from constituents on the issue of legalising cannabis. It's an issue that attracts a strong reaction, and those in favour of legalisation tend to shout louder than those against it. As drugs go, both legal or otherwise, it's fair to say that cannabis is not of the more serious variety. There doesn't tend to be the same widespread social disruption as a result of persons regularly using cannabis as opposed to persons who may be alcoholic or who are intravenous drug users. That in itself is not a strong enough argument for legalisation. The link between prolonged cannabis use and mental health related illnesses have been proven in some instances and should not be dismissed lightly. We need to listen to those working on the front line in our addiction services who have seen persons present who find it very difficult to end cannabis use. In the UK, we know from January 2004 to January 2009, the law in relation to cannabis was relaxed, so that cannabis went from a Class B to a Class C drug. A Newcastle University study showed that during that same period, smoking of the drug increased in the UK by 25% and smoking by 8%. Despite the smoking ban in Ireland, our per capita smoking levels are quite high in comparisons, say, to the UK or the US. This is something we need to think very carefully about if we were to legalise any new product like cannabis, that we can smoke with or without tobacco. The last thing Ireland needs is more smokers, with society as a whole paying for the added burden on our health system. Notwithstanding my reluctance to embrace legalising cannabis, I do acknowledge that there may be ways we can examine changing the current system to better effect. In the past week, many young people have contacted me about how their youthful experimentation with cannabis has caused them problems in later life, specifically in relation to work and visa applications. Some of them were caught in possession of relatively small amounts of the drug. Perhaps we need to examine the model adopted in Portugal and elsewhere where decriminalisation has been introduced. I've listened to people like Tony Gagan from the Merchants Quay project who has referenced this model in recent days, and I do think that is something that we should examine.
Minutes remaining.
In Portugal, they have decriminalised drug amounts for personal use, and what happens there if you're caught in possession, you face a panel, and which could comprise of a doctor, a social worker or a judge who decides what's the best course of action, be it a fine, a penalty, or often a course of drug treatment and counselling. If you are caught in possession of larger amounts than for personal use, you will face a judicial system. Since the introduction of decriminalisation in Portugal, drug use has declined significantly, and the way society views addiction has also changed. With regard to the issue of cannabis for medical use, many of those who contacted me in recent days outlined to me in great detail how using cannabis helps them in their illnesses, such as motor neurons and MS. I note that the Irish medical boards have recently approved the cannabinoid spray Sativex, which is also available under strict conditions in the UK.
Thank you, Deputy.
I do think that this whole issue needs to be examined, particularly in relation to the medical side of it. To conclude, I think this is a debate well worth having. I congratulate Deputy Flannagan for bringing it before us this evening. And I do believe that we need to look at every possible way to imaginatively and progressively tackle societal problems in relation to illegal drug use in this country. I believe from a medical point of view, from persons suffering from MS, from motor neurons disease, that the use of cannabis should be permitted. I'm not convinced that legalisation is the answer, but do think we should begin to look at decriminalisation as a way to prioritise drug rehabilitation over jail. That way society as a whole will benefit.
Thank you. I now call Deputy Niall Collins. 15 minutes.
Gormagus, Lascon Corla. Fianna Fáil is opposed to this motion. I wish to state that at the outset. The legalisation of cannabis in Ireland will do little to curb criminality while simultaneously jeopardising the health of generations of Irish people. The appeal of taking a libertarian approach to this problem is a failure of our responsibility to protect society from the harmful effects of drug abuse and the inevitable violent criminality it brings with it. Deputy Flannagan's misguided enthusiasm, and I say that respectfully, for this project down through the years belies the all-too-real dangers of cannabis. I do, however, acknowledge that Deputy Flannagan is a lifelong, consistent campaigner on this issue. As legislators, we have a duty to pursue the common good. The damage that legalising cannabis would inflict upon innumerable people across the country is a breach of that duty. This attempt to liberalise drug use is a deeply flawed view of what the common good is. It is particularly ironic that in a time when we are ramping up efforts to cut down on smoking, that we are now discussing adding a further dangerous substance to people's lives. Efforts to introduce plain packaging and copper fasten the smoking ban introduced by Micheál Martin are the new frontline in snuffing out tobacco use in Ireland. The work and progress made in tackling tobacco usage and the detrimental impact they have on people's health will pale into comparison to the challenges presented by wide-scale cannabis use. It begs the question that underpins this whole debate on this subject: why we would escalate a public health crisis by adding a new toxic substance into the mixture. Why would we risk undoing the good work achieved to date? Proponents of legalisation have not put forward a reasonable answer to that question. A number of other claims have to be made by advocates in favour of the legalisation that I would like to confront. First of all, in relation to alcohol, many of the arguments put forward by advocates of the bill point out the grave problems that alcohol abuse has inflicted upon Irish life. Undoubtedly, our collective national drink problem costs the Irish taxpayer hundreds of millions per annum in health and security costs. In contrast, proponents of the legalisation claim that cannabis has no such drawbacks. However, this is ultimately an argument in favour of prohibiting alcohol and not legalising cannabis. Unconsciously advocating for the Volstead Act does not mean endorsing the legalisation of cannabis. This is not a prohibition era of discussion. Our efforts to tackle the ongoing problems of endemic alcohol abuse in Ireland should not be diverted with a tangential attempt to legalise cannabis. In relation to criminality, it is extremely difficult to remove organised crime groups from a business if they are already involved. Any move to regulate the cannabis trade or license it would inevitably result in the creation of a shadow economy to undercut the legitimate trade. Evidence of this can be clearly seen, all too clearly, in the case of other substances such as tobacco, cigarettes, and alcohol. The €300 million industry estimate ignores the continual criminal role in this area. These products are sold and licensed in Ireland, but there is an equally vibrant black market trade in all of the above. Evidence has shown that consumers are not concerned with quality but price. The legitimate trade in cigarettes and tobacco in parts of Dublin has virtually collapsed because of the black market trade. Regulating the trade and use of cannabis would likely cause the illegal trade to flourish, as it would create a benign environment for drug use to take place and would probably strengthen the hand of organised crime gangs who would benefit from it. It's worth noting the problems the Dutch are facing with regard to the position they adopted in 1976 when they decriminalised possession of less than 5 grams in 1976. Amsterdam is now a centre of operation for most major organised crime outfits and a hub for hard drug distribution. The areas where coffee shops which sell cannabis exist all suffer from late-night disturbances, traffic jams, and hard drug dealing because of cross-border visits from Belgium and Germany where cannabis cannot be bought openly. The Dutch have attempted to repeal the laws but have backed down because they are too afraid that the country's drug-using population would cause further problems if they cannot source drugs from existing coffee shops. It's also worth noting that people licensed to produce cannabis for their own use would inevitably sell to friends and associates. Rather than prevent people from getting a criminal record, allowing people to produce a drug would inevitably encourage them to engage in petty dealing, therefore causing more problems for the justice system. The bill, as proposed, is effectively unenforceable and would be impossible to police. Excuse me. In relation to the health impact, much of the discussion of the health impact of cannabis strikes me as dangerously naive. It ignores the variety of cannabis available and the dangerous impact it has on users. The cannabis on sale in Ireland at the moment is primarily skunk grass, which is grown in secret grow houses under lights. In contrast, during the 1980s, about 70% of cannabis consumed in Ireland and Britain was cannabis resin, or hashish imported from North Africa. It was produced from wild-growing cannabis sativa in Morocco. This skunk is usually twice as potent as cannabis resin, although both were synonymous with triggering schizophrenia and mental health issues in certain types of people. Skunk is produced by crossing cannabis sativa and indica to produce a hardy plant that can be cultivated indoors. Skunk is genetically modified to such an extent that it bears no resemblance to the cannabis that would have been smoked in the 1960s. The bill makes no reference to what sort of cannabis plant would be permitted in Ireland. If it were to become law, criminals would simply undercut any legitimate trade to control the market by producing more potent plants. Criminals who grow the drug in Ireland are already focused on increasing the strength of the high from the crop they produce. One way they do this is by selecting plants that are naturally more potent. Another is to use lights to mimic the effect of autumn on the female plant. This causes it to produce more resin in a last-ditch attempt to pollinate itself before winter, and the resin is what makes it stronger. The variety of potency of the drug would inevitably create different markets, with criminal enterprises moving into one area over the other. In short, cannabis is harmful. Ireland's psychiatric hospitals are literally overwhelmed with young men who have developed psychiatric problems by using cannabis or newer varieties of it. If one considers that all pharmaceutical drugs and foods undergo a rigorous testing regime to see if they cause any side effects, then one can see the difficulties with permitting cannabis to be sold. In relation to commercialization, in straitened economic times, the idea of a viable commercial industry providing employment and making a contribution to the exchequer might seem appealing. However, the reality of attempting to commercialize cannabis production and sales throws up insurmountable problems. For the reasons stated above, any legitimate business which would enter into cannabis manufacture would, of course, have to secure insurance to operate. Given that tobacco and cigarette companies are being sued for selling products which cause cancer, it is hard to imagine how any limited company could comply with any HR, employment or health legislation given the activities it would be involved in. In terms of regulation, would persons who have criminal convictions be permitted to produce cannabis? The reality is that established dealers now with expertise in this area are involved in overtly criminal enterprises. The vista of a cannabis regulation authority will do nothing to curb their criminal engagement. In relation to head shops, in 2010, the then Fianna Fáil government took a strong stance in addressing the problem of psychoactive substances being sold in the so-called head shops. Criticism of the measure focused on the claims that banning head shops would do nothing to actually reduce the use of these dangerous substances, but would in effect drive them underground. In fact, the end result of the decisive measures taken against these substances was to significantly curb their usage, in particular amongst vulnerable adolescents. There is a lesson to be drawn from that experience in this debate. Eliminating head shops and banning dangerous substances that tread the boundary of legality was a positive measure to protect the safety of young people. Legalizing cannabis would be a perverse application of the lessons learned in that experience. If the sale of cannabis was to be permitted, it would create a benign environment for illicit drug dealing, for illicit drug use to flourish. In conclusion, Lascam Corla, the debate does bring an opportunity to reappraise how we resource the Gardaí in tackling drug-fueled criminality, and whether resources are better directed towards high-level suppliers rather than low-end users. Garda discretion is key in empowering the force to realistically tackle drug abuse in the country. There needs to be a debate around the use of the adult caution and the impact of our current system has upon the Justice Administration. It also behoves us to ask the questions as to why drug abuse flourishes in our society and what we can do to address it. It is an immense task of both supply and demand, and any drug strategy must address both aspects. However, the principle that cannabis should be legalized is simply indefensible. The health and social risks are far too great for us to countenance. The bill is a deeply flawed measure reflecting faulty assumptions. We need to stand up to the allure of populist measures and do what is right for the greater good of the country.
Now call Deputy Sandra McClellan.
We welcome the debate on the question of cannabis legalisation. On the basis that this debate is needed and should prove informative, we commend Deputy Flannagan for bringing forward this bill. While we will not be voting in favour of this bill, we believe that there is merit in a thorough and critical examination of all aspects of how problem drug use is addressed in our society. The question of cannabis legalisation is one which divides opinion sharply, but one which definitely needs to be teased out and debated in a calm, considered fashion. We need to get beyond a facile adversarial approach. Hysteria is not what we need. We need to approach this in an evidence-based way and draw our conclusions from the evidence. We need to look at problem drug use, including cannabis and alcohol, in a holistic manner, taking into account the implications for individual health, the effects on wider society, and role of the justice system. One of two main arguments made in favour of cannabis legalisation is that the drug is less harmful than other drugs. That may be so, but that is only in relative terms, and we do not believe this is a valid argument for legalisation. This drug can still have serious detrimental effects on people's health. There is some considerable concern with the medical community on the effect of cannabis on schizophrenia and psychosis, and that cannabis use can increase the likelihood of the onset of psychosis. From a health point of view, there is a legitimate concern that legalisation would lead to even wider problem use of the drug. There is surely validity in the argument that legalisation would run contrary to the efforts that we are making to combat tobacco smoking and the problem use of other drugs, including alcohol. And though I know others will make this point, it is important that we note the huge damage which alcohol abuse causes in Ireland in terms of health and in terms of public safety, and its implications for our healthcare system. We need to work very hard to ensure that we tackle alcohol misuse as well as illegal substances. The second main argument used for cannabis legalisation is that it would take what is admittedly a very widely used drug out of the hands of organised criminals and free up resources for combating the trade in more damaging drugs. In 2009, Sinn Féin published our proposed priorities for the National Drug Strategy 2009 to 2016. In that document, we state that the spectrum of drug-related crime must be understood if justice and public policy is effectively to reduce such crime. The Drug Policy Action Group categorised drug crime as systemic, economic compulsive, and psychopharmacological crime. Systemic crimes describe drug trafficking, dealing, possession, and associated gangland crime, including murder, intimidation, and money laundering. Economic compulsive crime describes robbery to feed a drug habit, and psychopharmacological crime includes violence against people or property destruction caused by the mental or behavioural effects of drug taking. We argued in our submission that law enforcement efforts and resources must be matched to the priorities arising from an objective understanding of the three main types of drug-related crime described. The rates of prosecution relating to heroin and cocaine compared to those for cannabis do not match the far greater relative harm caused by the former drugs. The focus of policing efforts should be systematically matched to the relative harm caused by the various drugs.
1 minute remaining.
The understanding of harm to include that to individuals, to communities, and to wider society. This requires a critical examination of how our policing and justice system addresses problem drug use, and we should not shy away from that examination. Sinn Féin has never supported the legalisation of cannabis, though strong arguments have been made on both sides. This position has been reaffirmed at successive party Ardeshina. The health implications associated with this drug, like tobacco, are very serious and have the potential to have a significant negative effect on public health. On the separate but related issue of the medicinal benefits of cannabis and cannabis-derived compounds, there is significant scientific evidence to support the case for the introduction of such products here. We would, of course, await the expert advice of the relevant Irish regulatory authorities, including the National Immunisation Advisory Committee, the National Pharmacoeconomic Centre and the Irish Medicines Board. Again, we must allow expertise to be the basis for our decisions, but if there is evidence to support its introduction, then we should consider it.
Margaret, could I ask you to move that the debate be adjourned? Margaret, Tá Dáil Atlo G. Lahoutrishni Michael Mouth, the door stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning.
On the private members' bill.
So, Margaret, Minister, I welcome a debate on drugs at any stage, whether it's legal or illegal, because our society has never fully got to grips with drugs as an issue, the abuse of drugs and the availability of drugs. And I understand where Deputy Flannagan is coming from with the motion and his bill, but I won't be supporting it. But I do encourage an open, informed debate on the issue of drugs, and I've encouraged my own party to continuously have that, to look again and again to see if there is an alternative way of tackling the scourge that is drugs, and it's not illegal drugs only, because one of the biggest scourge of drugs in our country is alcohol, and people need to bear that in mind. Because one of the ways I've always measured this debate is, why would we legalise another drug in Ireland when we can't cope with the legal drugs, the alcohol, the tobacco, or the prescription drugs? And we've seen the consequences of all of those legal drugs, and then we've also seen the consequences on our society of the illegal drugs. We can't cope with it, and until such time as our society gets to grip with the drugs issue, both those which are legal and those which are illegal, I don't think that we should be going down the road of looking to legalise further drugs. Because the constituency I represent is one of the hardest hits by the drug scourge, the illegal one in Europe, but also the legal one. It is a constituency which has one of the biggest producers of a legal drug, Guinness, in our constituency. But that factory is regulated. It is within the law. It is done in a way that over generations and over decades and centuries, kind of alcohol in our society is regulated. Yet, we are still seeing the consequences in A&E every weekend, not even every weekend, every night of the day. We are seeing the consequence of abuse of alcohol in our prisons, in our schools, everywhere in our society, but in particular in those areas which are poorest and most disadvantaged in Ireland. But drugs don't know a class boundary, kind of, because it hits right across. And I've heard the argument that cannabis, weed, or hash, whichever name or whichever description we wish to give, kind of isn't that bad. It doesn't really affect people that much. Kind of, sure, wouldn't it be okay, kind of, because there's hundreds of thousands of people in our society who use it or abuse it every day. But because something happens doesn't make it legal and doesn't make it right. Because I remember arguing with somebody about the argument about decriminalising it. And I had some sympathy for that. And I understand the consequences kind of for young people who are caught with a few spliffs. Kind of that can have consequences for the rest of their lives. But if we were to use the same argument, then why not decriminalise joyriding or other activities that young people have got involved in the past? The way of tackling people who are convicted, who have caught on the wrong side of the law for what some people would term minor offences, is through kind of a legislation to spend convictions legislation. So if somebody is 15 or 16 or 20 or whatever, happens to get caught up in illegal drug activity for their own use, and that there is a way out in the future, that forever and a day that they are not condemned to suffer the consequences of a mistake or several small mistakes. But there is another side to the illegal drug activities in our society. And it is that which I would caution against any change. Because the very people who have benefited from a lack of seriousness on the drugs issue in our society, a lack of a proper planned approach to drugs, whether it's the criminal response coupled with the response in terms of mental health, in terms of self-awareness in schools. People who've benefited are the drug dealers. And because one drug would be legalised, won't prevent them from plying their trade. And I take no truck in the argument, oh, well, the hash head down the road kind of is okay. He's only selling that. He doesn't do anything else. Well, I know in my community and in my constituency and right across this city, the very same people are the ones who are bringing in the guns, the heroin and the cocaine into this country, who are also involved in the cannabis trade. And I have seen, and everybody has seen, the consequences of that trade. The consequences on the street, young people getting caught up in violence, intimidation, in jail, or dead as a consequence of drugs war, or in consequences of being in debt to a local drug dealer, whether it's a debt from weed or from cocaine. That is the facts in our communities. And we have seen whole communities destroyed because of that. And people will say, well, kind of, obviously the war on drugs has failed. Well, I don't believe it was ever fully declared by the state. We are an island nation. Kind of, we could have done a lot more to prevent the importation of cocaine, heroin, and hash into our country. We could have done a lot more in terms of capturing young people at an early age to ensure that they didn't become dependent on any drug, whether it was legal or illegal. I think we could have done a lot more to ensure that our education purpose was right. For instance, in this area, as we speak, there is no drugs unit tied to Kevin Street Garda Station, one of the areas which covers one of the most hardest hit by the drug scourge in this city. Now, the problem is to do with people getting promoted and everything else, but at this very stage, there is no drugs unit. And also, over the years, there hasn't been enough concentration within the Garda Síochána on drugs units. There hasn't been enough concentration by the state in terms of subsidising or funding the drugs task forces. So, for instance, in this budget, once again, kind of the government implements a 7% cut on the budget of those who are specifically tasked to try and address the problem of illegal drugs and legal drugs, because only a few years ago, kind of under the Fianna Fáil government, they decided that task forces should also deal with the questions of alcohol. I have absolutely no problem with that, but they didn't increase the budget, and ever since then, the budgets for task forces has been cut. What type of message goes out kind of to those who are involved in trying to highlight the dangers of drugs when you're continuously cutting it. So I'd urge the Minister, at the very least, as part of this debate, to rethink that 7% cut that was announced in the budget. Kind of one of the concerns I have in this issue is that there's been a systematic increase in the potency of cannabis in recent years and the consequences to the abusers. So, for instance, the THT, the psychoactive ingredient which gives an individual a high or a euphoric feeling, has increased. So in hash, it's gone from 3% to nearly 15% in some cases. But that in weed, it can range from 15% to 40%. And that is absolutely scary, because there is consequence to an increase in that potency and the decrease that's happening in terms of the anti-psychotic element, which if you want, is the counterbalance. So at the moment, the drugs that are being sold in Ireland are increasing in potency, and there is a consequence in terms of aggression, in terms of paranoia, irritability, disturbed sleep, psychological dependence, but also in terms of mental health, self-harm, suicidal tendencies, and involvement then also because of the dependency in criminal gangs and the like. So I would urge people to continue with the debate, to continue to look at it, but also to look at the other alternative to ensure that we ramp up the war on drugs, illegal and legal, in this country.
Now calling Deputy Robert Dowd to sharing time with Deputies Mulhern, Connaughton, Durkin, Maloney, Mitchell O'Connor and Keating. Deputy Durkin and Connaughton are sharing a 5-minute slot. Deputy Dowd, you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. That's Count Corla. In my remarks on this subject, I really wanted to dwell on the wider issue rather than just cannabis. And in that sense, I welcome the fact that there is a motion on drugs being discussed, even if it's only on one relatively minor drug in terms of harm being done. I'm calling on the government to set up a high-powered committee to report on how best to tackle illegal drugs and drug-related crime within a year. And I'm doing so because every day in my constituency, I see the huge negative effect of both legal and illegal drugs on many parts of the community I represent. And this can take effect in a number of ways: antisocial behaviour, intimidation, violence, and even death. In one area of my constituency, which overlaps with a neighbouring constituency, there have been 16 murders in the last 4 years. Many, if not most, of these deaths bear a relationship with drugs, again, either legal or illegal. And almost as bad as that is the fact that there have been attempted murders, sometimes with really grim results. And for example, in one case that I personally know, a totally innocent man shot and left unable to speak and unable to walk. And that is why I am calling for immediate action in terms of examining how best to deal with the whole wider issue of tackling illegal drugs, because they are so linked with criminality that it is, we are not getting on top of it. I mean, in conversations I've had with local Gardaí, they say that at most they catch 10% of what comes in illegally. So we have to recognise that our present approach is not working. And I mean, the whole issue of cannabis is a sort of a minor aspect of this whole thing. I'm very conscious of the fact that because Ireland is a small country, whatever we do, either in relation to cannabis or in relation to other drugs, it would probably be better if we could work out a cross-border agreement as to how to deal with drugs. Although in the meantime, I think we could learn something from the experience of Portugal, which, from what I can find out, seems to tackle not so much anybody who is handling small amounts of drugs for themselves, but goes after the people who are doing the supplying. And there, in Portugal, drug abuse amongst 13 to 15-year-olds
since 2001 has fallen from 14.1% to 10%. HIV infection has dropped 17%, and drug trafficking dropped, and also drug-related deaths has fallen by about a third. So I do think we have a great deal of work to do to tackle the issue generally. And as I say, I understand that, you know, cannabis in this regard is a very minor matter. But again, if I, in conclusion, if I can go back to my original point, I really think the government needs to set up a high-powered committee to report within a year on how best to tackle illegal drugs and drug-related crime. And it is the most vulnerable communities who have least voice in this chamber who would benefit most from that. And for that reason, I feel it is my duty to speak up for them so that they stop suffering in the way that they have had to suffer for so long. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Michelle Mulcair.
Thank you, Cian Corla. The push to legalise cannabis, thanks to social media and, of course, the current proponents, seems new, but it is not. This is, in fact, a tired old story rehashing a case, so to speak, that has already been lost some decades ago. Generations past, in particular during the freewheeling decade of the 60s in both Europe and the United States, seriously experimented openly with all sorts of so-called mind-expanding drugs, including cannabis. This included people from all walks of society and professionals from all disciplines who at the time heralded that drug-embracing era as an advancement for civilization and mankind and as a gateway to enlightenment. However, that lifestyle was ultimately left behind by most and ultimately rejected as a youth's urge to rebel is tempered by life's personal experience and reveals the sobering truth about taking drugs. These people are the grandparents of today. They have, in effect, heard it all before. They could tell us things, impart wisdom, if we could only listen. So cannabis and these many other drugs remained banned substances in many of these Western countries, and for very good reason. They are drugs. Besides food, drink, and clean air, human health requires a healthy mind. Everything else can be considered secondary, and drugs in particular are an antidote to ill health and are prescribed by qualified doctors to aid recovery or to ease discomfort for the incurable. In fact, the significant, compelling body of medical evidence and research shows the misuse of cannabis, especially long-term use, poses a significant risk of heart and lung problems and cancer, and of serious mental health problems, including paranoia, schizophrenia, and depression. Frighteningly, from a young age, its use can impair brain development. Therefore, the push to legalise banned substances by proponents outside the medical profession is nothing more than self-indulgence disguised as concern for the ill or the economy. It is this duplicity that makes the case for the drug seem like a product of its own influence rather than that of sound judgment. Mind-bending drugs are just that, mind-bending, impairing judgment and therefore rendering the user unfit to make judgments for the reasonable-minded citizens of any serious nation and its governing bodies. But there is no admission to this by proponents. We do not wish to have our police or doctors or judges or our policymakers under any influence other than a sound mind. Who can say precisely what one under the influence is thinking, or channeling for that matter, that they might be held accountable to the rest of society? We do not want to ride buses, trains or planes driven by drivers or pilots under the influence of anything other than their training and experience that featured in their job description when they interviewed for the job. Those who wish to see a banned substance legalised on no ground other than it's harmless or the ground that law enforcement has failed to curb the problem are under an influence that the serious, sober-minded could never possibly understand or subscribe to. It would seem in the mind-altered state anything is possible. One main reason the substance in question remains banned, as I have alluded to, is control. Control as to how we might govern its use, as we do with alcohol and to a lesser extent tobacco, and control by the user. One cannot prescribe the minimum amount for safe use nor control its abuse. Those who take it are under an influence hard or impossible to detect. What that influence becomes when combined with alcohol and other prescribed drugs is unknown. Older societies, such as the Native American Indians, restricted its use to the initiated, and its social use was always within prescribed rituals, with very specific goals. Its use by individuals indiscriminately was taboo and would have incurred penalties because it was deemed antisocial. Today, the fragmentation of society as it is would make the lift of the ban on the use of cannabis, no doubt increasing its use, a dangerous social experiment with no means of controlling its abuse by a minority of people who are susceptible to influences that lead to antisocial behaviour. The Gardaí, as it is, have their work cut out for them in this country, policing the parameters of the legal use of alcohol. Adding drugs to that mix would be irresponsible of any government, if not downright reckless endangerment of our citizens. I completely oppose the motion here tonight.
Thank you. I now call on Deputy Paul Connaughton, sharing his time with Deputy Durkin. 2.5 minutes each.
Perfect. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak on this and very much welcome the debate. I think one of the things I find a bit frustrating about private members' business, it'd be very easy to come in and just knock this and say we can't do it and what's the point of debating it. I think we have to start with the reality in this situation is that this drug is available the length and breadth of this country in every town and every village. And to not start with that context would be misleading from the beginning. So this drug does exist, people have access to it, and what we want to do about that is going to be the next step after that. I would have my own issues and my own concerns in relation to this. I wouldn't support the full legalization of this drug, but to say that it's not accessible to people at the moment would be wrong beyond belief. I do have no issue whatsoever with actually legalizing it for medical reasons. We all have people in and out of our clinics who've been told by their GPs and their doctors that this drug, for medical reasons, will give them much comfort and much support. And I think that has to be looked at. I believe the Minister mentioned something last night in relation to Sativex eventually becoming on the market, and that's to be very welcome. But I do think there's one other area we really have to focus on this debate that seems to get lost. First of all, we cannot compare cannabis to the rest of the drugs. We talk about heroin, we talk about cocaine. We can lump them all in together if we want, but that simply wouldn't be the reality of the situation. So we have to take the motion as what it is in relation to this. What I would like to say is there will be people in this room tonight and who are going to vote against this, maybe a small number, but they're hypocrites. Because they'll have no issue with someone having 2 or 3 pints at night and driving home. So the issue with alcohol, well, no, that's not such an issue. But when it comes to this, they'll slap it down straight away and say, no, we can't do it whatsoever.
No, may the one.
Now, I'm not agreeing with legalizing cannabis because of the alcohol situation, but we can't have it both ways. Alcohol is a drug as much as cannabis is a drug. There are more families, the length and breadth of this country, who've had their lives destroyed by the misuse and the abuse of alcohol as much as anything to do with illegal drugs. Again, I'm not saying legalize cannabis for that reason, but we can't be so hypocritical as to say they're not even linked in one way. In 2.5 minutes, even in 3 hours, it is not possible to discuss this in as much detail as it should be. Tonight should not be the end of this debate. It really should just be the beginning of it. I'm not saying legalize it completely, but we have to look at all the options. We cannot keep coming in here and saying one thing and going outside and saying another. We have an issue in this country with alcohol as much as we do with drugs. Unless we face up to that, we cannot have an honest debate about this one way or another. Thank you.
Come on with Chuck de Bernard Durkin.
I have to say that I am totally opposed to the proposal, and I want to just mention a few things. First of all, the availability of a particular drug, whether it's freely available or not, is not necessarily the issue. The issue is whether it is good for the person who takes it, and whether it should be uncontrolled. And obviously, there are properties that are beneficial to people in pain and so on and so forth, and we recognize that. The way to do that, of course, is by way of prescription, not the way that has been suggested. Because remember one thing, it is habit forming. I was one of the people who became involved some years ago in the Amsterdam project, the Zurich experiment, and I, along with the late Tony Gregory and a number of other people in this house, visited those areas at that particular time to find out how the liberalization of certain drugs had worked there, and it didn't, is the answer. It led to increased abuse. It was uncontrolled abuse, and it is intrinsically bad to suggest that, in this kind of situation, it is better than the situation we have. It isn't. And the suggestions and the references made to Portugal. The reason that drug abuse has dropped in Portugal is because the police have taken out the barons, the supply chain. And that's the reason. And that was proven beyond any shadow of doubt. And Deputy Flannagan mentioned it last night, you know, that this was mentioned in one of the debates last night. That's the answer to it. That's the answer to the question. The other point I want to mention is this, is that the gateway element is very, very, very dangerous. And I don't know whether we realize what we're talking about or not. But if we suggest in this House that young people in the out in the community are going to be better served by a more availability of a drug which is a gateway drug, I'm afraid we're wrong, and we're giving a very bad example, and we shouldn't go down that particular road. There is no scientific evidence to suggest or to support the suggestion other than opinions expressed by people and in relation to whom there are other opinions equally held and strong. I want to finish with this one, and just for the sake of argument. When prohibition in relation to, and I recognize the points in relation to alcohol, when prohibition ended in the United States, use of alcohol increased by 4,000%.
Deputy Éireann Maloney. It's 5 minutes.
Firstly, can I just say that as a citizen of the state that we enjoy our drugs in Ireland. They're popular. Be it the national drug referred to earlier, alcohol, and all of the other ones. I think probably cannabis is probably the second on the chart in terms of popularity. Given that we're in a recession. However, we're back in the days of the Celtic Tiger when all the yuppies had enough money to buy lines of Coke. Coke replaced other drugs, and for a period became the second most popular one. But I agree with some of the points that's been made, but we have to be careful here, you know, as legislators about when dealing with this issue, because we have to look at it, I think, in terms of its totality. And, you know, I won't be supporting the thing, I won't be supporting the motion, but can I just say this, that I was at one of the recent, as other members here, where the recent report from the Rape Crisis Centre and also the domestic violence report, I cannot remember to my shame. But interesting, someone made a point talking about the domestic violence thing and separately the rape thing, about the effect on children and families, you know. And I think we have to sort of, all of us have to change our sort of attitude to this thing that we can use, you know, that the use of cannabis or coke is a sort of a very privileged individual choice and a right worth dying for. But I'll tell you, that if you sit down and read either of these reports and your stomach doesn't turn over on the effect, firstly in relation to alcohol, and secondly in relation to weed, because it's not just a simple matter of saying we can legislate for another drug and that it's up to the individual and that that's the person. That's a load of rubbish. It's a load of rubbish. There are thousands of kids in care tonight, in care, because of the national drug, followed by the one we're discussing here, et cetera, et cetera. And can I just to add to that, I think there is a bit of a change in fairness to this Dáil. I hear things here which, well, like some others, I'm not here very long, fortunately, but I've heard some which are sort of encouraging signs. Like when you hear people talk about even using the phrase, I never thought I'd hear it here, people using the phrase alcohol and other drugs. Let's grow up about this thing and say it. Just say it. And I mean, it's okay for, I don't know about the rest of you, but I mean, I'm a user. I enjoy my porter. I make no, but I don't make a profession of it, you know? It's not, but we have to be, I think as legislators, we have to be sort of brave with this thing. But I think perhaps we might focus on doing something about the national drug before we bring another monster on board. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. And one of the best illustrations of this, and I know you did your best, colleague Mr. White, but I think to our shame, we had a recent report on the below cost selling. I won't comment on, it's irrelevant what my own views about that. But the other thing about sponsorship, you know, the alcohol industry sponsoring sport events and festivals, etc. I mean, do we not get it why the alcohol industry sponsors sporting bodies and festivals. They don't do it primarily to promote drink. They don't. That's not the principal reason. They do it because it gives the edge in terms of the image and the brand and this old paddy whackery thing that, sure, what did a few drinks ever do to a man? He's only had a few pints, etc. Read the report on domestic violence. You'll see what a few pints does for some guys. Okay, some people can control the thing. There are men and women who've never been drunk in their lives and have no ambition to be. But let us be honest about this. There are people who cannot handle it, and if there's any doubts about that, look at the report on the rape. As a man, an Irishman, it makes you feel ashamed of what's going on. And without getting into the details, child abuse in this country. And it is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily related to the national drug. But we can't deal with it. And it is disappointing that, I've always had a very clear view about it, and the Minister is aware of this. I disapprove of any alcohol company sponsoring any sporting body. I think when a child goes into the Aviva or into Croke Park, the last thing they want to see is the national drug advertised.
Now call Deputy Mary Mitchell O'Connor.
Thank
5
you.
minutes.
Cathaoirleach, as a member of the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Health and Children, I am totally opposed to this ill-thought-out bill. This bill is unreasonable and frankly reckless and dangerous. Make no mistake about it, cannabis can have a devastating effect on an individual's mental and physical health. I strongly oppose this bill for the following reasons. Firstly, that the argument that the substance is not addictive is frankly laughable, frankly dopey. Addiction is described as creating an insatiable craving for a substance that produces a desired result. The use of cannabis produces an effect that is highly addictive. Secondly, the health effects of cannabis cannot be ignored. I believe that the resulting impacts of recreational use negate the pro-arguments for legalizing cannabis. Studies have shown that an individual's mental health is particularly vulnerable to cannabis use and its negative effects. For example, research has shown that the number of those suffering from depression doubled and anxiety was 5 times higher in users than non-users. And in the short term, users may also experience paranoia or hallucinations. Cannabis has also been shown to increase the risk of lung cancer, increasing the likelihood by 8% every year of use. It can increase an individual's heart rate and the likelihood of a stroke. I question the introduction of this bill, that it would propagate the use of a substance that it could only serve to negatively impact the health of our society. As a parent, the negative effects cannabis has on young people causes me great concern. I would never, ever recommend the use of cannabis to any of my own 2 sons. And I can tell you that I would never, ever recommend it use to any other person. Cannabis use is highest in the people aged 15 to 24 years old. This has worrying implications. This is the period when the brain is developing. Young people using cannabis during this vital stage are at risk of cognitive impairment, decreasing academic performances, or depression. I believe we would be reckless by giving a message to our young people that cannabis is harmless. This bill would undoubtedly see an increase in the availability of cannabis within our society. With regards to Deputy Flannagan's inclusion of age restrictions, I believe that young people will find it easier to access this substance more than ever before. Unfortunately, we need only to look at the figures of underage drinking to know that age restrictions are not always effective. Furthermore, I believe that Provision 17 regarding home-cultivated cannabis is an inadequate measure in preventing young people accessing it in their own homes. The idea that a lockable space will prevent a teenager's curiosity is idealistic and at its best ludicrous. Children always know where the sweets are kept, and teenagers have all discovered their parents' drinks cabinet.
It's 1 minute remaining.
Thank you. Legalising cannabis simply comes with far too many significant risk factors. Beyond the blatant health ramifications, any attempt to legalise cannabis may set a dangerous precedent in regards to other restricted substances. I fundamentally oppose making cannabis more readily available in our society. It has no benefits that justify the costs that will accrue.
I now call Deputy Derek Keating.
And I thank the Ceann Comhairle for giving me the opportunity to address Deputy Flanagan's bill entitled the Cannabis Regulation Bill. The opening line of this bill, I think, reveals the true nature of what I consider to be a reckless and insidious proposal by Deputy Flanagan. The purpose of this bill is to provide for the regulation of cannabis for recreational use. Now, I've publicly gone on record previously of my objection to this motion. I stated last year in the House that if adopted, I believe we will see Ireland becoming an even bigger gateway to illegal drugs importation, as we have seen over the last number of years, where massive hauls of cannabis, heroin, cocaine, and indeed other illicit substances, including tobacco, have been made available by the gangster underworld in every street, every community, every parish, every town, and every city in the Republic of Ireland. A light touch policy being proposed should be rejected out of hand. And I'm calling on those who propose this private member's business and those who are considering supporting it to really think again, to look at the evidence and to consider, for example, the points recently made by Professor Jim Lucy of Trinity College. Professor Lucy has stated in unquestionable evidence that cannabis harms the brain. It is one of the most toxic substances. It rests in the body for up to 90 days. It damages the brain, it impairs the capacity of the user, and indeed it is evident to me that it is a gateway drug. As an elected TD for a community that has been blighted by drug barons, including those in the IRA and other such organisations who hide behind their political agenda, I'm only too familiar with the facts that have been presented to us in the media. I've seen at first hand many hundreds of individuals with zombie-like personalities walking in some areas of my constituency, and I'm sure that most other TDs, if not all TDs, have had similar experiences. And the use of the colloquial love-hate expression comes to mind. Goofing off, strung out, individuals waiting for their next fix, contemplating their next crime, and considering their next opportunistic attack on society to feed their habit. And Deputy Flanagan is proposing to make this drug available to beat the drug barons and address the serious crimes that goes with illicit drugs. I believe that Deputy Flanagan is looking too much at one of his close friends, Midge, of love-hate fame. I'm wondering if Deputy Flanagan would admit to taking or smoking cannabis himself. I am proposing that this bill be rejected out of hand by each and every member of this House and be replaced with a commitment, a renewal to support those professional, voluntary and community leaders who are working at the coalface with drug addicts, some as young as 12 years old, to educate against the effects of the substance, as I've already stated, that some of which has been outlined by Professor Lucy of Trinity College. And I also ask you to consider tonight what message we may send to the 10 and the 12-year-olds whose lives may not have been affected or may not have been damaged by drugs. I believe we are sending those children a message that Ireland today is considering becoming even more tolerant of illegal and dangerous drugs. This bill also proposes that the government supports the production and the retailing of cannabis and cannabis products. Can I see a time when there will be the Deputy Ming Flanagan's Farmers Market? Buy one, get one free. Not in retailing, it shouldn't be allowed. On a more serious note, this private member's bill is a dangerous proposal when we consider the research carried out by the National University of Ireland, which showed that up to 8% of children under 10 years of age have used cannabis in the last 12 months. Is Deputy Flannagan serious about this proposal? And who gave him the mandate to represent his constituents? Or should I say, are those who gave him the mandate to represent his constituents satisfied that his sole purpose is to legalise illicit drugs and add to the tragedies that already exist throughout most, if not every town in this country? I reject this private member's bill. I also reject the hidden agenda of Deputy Flannagan, and I call on those on the opposite side, from all shades of political opinion, to consider this matter and to withdraw, to ask for this private member's bill to withdraw before this vote tonight.
The next speaking slot is shared by Deputies Clare Daly, Joe Higgins, Catherine Murphy, Joan Collins, John Halligan, 6 minutes each. Deputy Clare Daly.
Thanks, Count Corla. Well, if I wasn't sure about supporting this legislation, any doubts I might have had have been absolutely quashed now, having listened to the last speaker. I very much welcome this discussion. I fully accept that it is absolutely inevitable that cannabis will be legalised in Ireland. I don't think that's going to happen here tonight because, like everything else, the political establishment lags behind the attitudes of ordinary people on this issue as on everything else. But I think it is an important strategic milestone in moving Irish society forward in discussing issues like this. Now, on Monday morning, I was stopped by a man on the streets of Dublin who asked me what my attitude to Deputy Flannagan's legislation was. And when I told him I was supporting it, he thanked me for that, told me a story of how his friend was dying of cancer and how he and 3 of his friends take it in turns to break the law and secure cannabis for that person. And he said, imagine, we're risking a jail sentence for that, for showing decent humanity. Well, he says it's worth it, and it's something I do again, and I think it's something that anybody here would do. And in actual fact, I think this discussion alone will highlight the fact to many Irish citizens that there's very important beneficial uses of cannabis in terms of pain relief for arthritis, MS, some cancers and so on. And surely we should be promoting, in that medical sense, anything that can make life easier for people who are suffering. How could that be a bad thing? And as the man who stopped me on the street said, at 63 years of age, he said, I think I should be allowed to make decisions like that myself. In terms of my life, he said, but also particularly in terms of my death and how that's handled. Let's be clear about this discussion. This bill isn't about introducing cannabis into Ireland. Cannabis is already here. Over 250,000 regular users of cannabis during the last estimate, over 7% of the population. Not just radical young people outlined by Deputy Mulhern, young people, old people, farmers, housewives, workers. Anybody who wants to get cannabis can get it. And this bill is simply about regulating that situation for 2 very simple reasons. Firstly, so that the users of that are not criminalised, and secondly, so that the criminals don't profit from it. It really is, in my opinion, that simple. And for both those reasons, society would be the beneficiary of this legislation being passed. Now, we've had a lot of emails over the last few days from people who are nearly claiming that cannabis is a solution to everything, almost with magical powers. Well, I don't believe in magic, and I don't believe that either. I accept that cannabis isn't harmless. I accept that it can cause problems which vary from user to user, as does alcohol, as do prescription drugs, as do all other drugs in that regard. But criminalising that activity is not a way of dealing with it. This is a health matter and can be only dealt with through the health service. I recognise also that there are no recorded deaths from the use of cannabis alone. Maybe it is a contributing factor. We can make that argument about anything. I could put forward a very rational argument why sugar, fast food, soft drinks and that which contribute to obesity result in deaths and contribute to deaths. Of course that they do. And the fact that I may personally not choose or be interested in particularly smoking cannabis or whatever, I'm not interested in drinking gin or vodka either, it doesn't necessarily mean that the activity should be outlawed. I know in many ways, and it was argued previously by the great socialist Jim Larkin, who used to crusade against alcoholism on the basis that it made workers passive and it suited the establishment, and that argument could be put forward about cannabis and other drugs as well. But what is also a fact is that the proper use of drugs can be beneficial to people for both recreational and medical reasons, and humankind has always operated and worked with drugs, be it back to Homer's The Odyssey or whatever. We've always had it, and to deny that that's a case is just a sick joke. Prohibition doesn't work. The points have been highlighted very well. It creates a black market, which is unpoliceable. It diverts resources away from rehabilitation, from education that could tackle these issues. Now, points have been made about other jurisdictions moving in the direction of legalisation. They've been well articulated. Obviously, the main reason in Portugal was the fact that incarceration was more expensive than treatment. And Deputy Durkan argues that no, the reason was that the barons were taken out of circulation. Well, maybe the barons were able to be taken out of circulation by the police in Portugal because they had a bit of time on their hands to deal with them, because they didn't have to run around arresting young people for using cannabis. And that's one of the essential points put forward by this bill here today. It's a shocking waste of resources. It could be a source of revenue if it was taxed properly, probably yielding hundreds of millions of euro. It would reduce criminal activity. It would reduce stigma and the marginalisation of drug users. It would create a safer environment for those who use and purchase recreational drugs, and it would, in my opinion, control the product of the quality of the product, which is a difficulty. Communities have been devastated by drug use. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But for government backbenchers who have stood over austerity and the poverty and hopelessness that has actually destroyed these communities and tried to blame that on cannabis use is, in my opinion, an absolute and utter disgrace. This is an opportunity to divert resources into revitalising communities, supporting people in education and rehabilitation, and I think it would be a very positive step forward.
Deputy Joe Higgins.
Pascal Corley, the motion before the Dáil calls for the government to introduce legislation to regulate the cultivation, sale and possession of cannabis and cannabis products in Ireland. I support that, and I welcome the motion put forward by Deputy Luke Flannagan and the discussion that it is giving rise to. It's not a question of being for cannabis use as a recreational outlet, any more than one is for the use of ethyl alcohol or nicotine. It is a matter of realizing that drugs have been used by humanity for thousands of years and will continue to be used. Also, it is the reality that just about every drug can have harmful side effects and consequences, especially if overindulged in. The question for me is, what is the most effective means of achieving harm reduction with regard to any drug that is available in society, legally or illegally? How best to have a situation where people can appreciate whatever enjoyment or relaxation they get from drugs, but minimize the ill effects on people and on society. Now, with regard to cannabis, in my view, the best way to do this is to decriminalize and to regulate its production, supply, and use. It is beyond doubt that people suffering from some very difficult diseases can ease their suffering by taking cannabis, and it is cruel beyond belief to deny them the right to do that. Cannabis derives from a very natural herb. Why in medicine should it be banned while at the same time multinational pharmaceutical companies make a fortune creating synthetic drugs at a huge cost to achieve what a natural product could do? Now, in a situation where cannabis use is decriminalized totally, I would be absolutely opposed to its production or supply becoming a source of enrichment by private corporations in particular. There should be a state monopoly in regard to any new drug that would be legalized and regulated in our society. There should be absolutely no advertising, simply factual information on the quality and the quantity, etc., where it would be available, and that would be it. Absolutely ban the cannabis, for example, as a source of profiteering by private corporations. Now, the reality is that the biggest drug pushers in this state are pillars of the Irish establishment and carry on their business quite legally. They push nicotine. In particular, they push ethyl alcohol. And the drug-pushing companies that do this are feted in society. Ministers regularly rub shoulders with them at sporting events and other events that the alcohol industry sponsors. And I've no doubt that some of the politicians that were in here denouncing the motion also rub shoulders and go to events sponsored by them, and maybe even look for sponsorship for some of their local clubs. There is a massive hypocrisy in this country with regard to the fact that these are extremely dangerous drugs, but they're legal. Yet people want to come in and criminalize a section of the population, and it's quite a substantial section of the population that wants to use another drug of their choice that arguably, and I think realistically, does far less damage, or has the potential to do that, far less damage. I believe also that the regulation as called for would remove these cutthroat gangsters from the scene and the enrichment of themselves and damage that they do to society, because they do not discriminate between the likes of cannabis and far, far more lethal drugs that have laid havoc in inner city societies and in other parts of the country. They would be seriously weakened if it's taken from the shadows and the reality is recognized. Finally, last Ceann Comhairle, you know, capitalism and its manifestation of austerity creates a society that creates huge problems and harm for people. The current crisis, for example, all over Europe, creating massive suffering, mental, physical, social suffering. It is a fact that many people do seek relief from that suffering in drugs, mostly legal drugs to be honest, overindulge and do themselves huge damage. I believe that in supporting this, also in building a society where there is enough and plenty for every human being, and these pressures brought about by austerity and the financial market system are reduced, are eliminated, so that people can have decent lives and free lives, and then with the less pressure are in a much better frame of mind to choose as to what drugs they use or don't use. And in my view, that it would also lessen hugely the damage that is being done by all drugs, all kinds of drugs, legal drugs, in our society at the present time.
Go Margaret Jacta and Jacta Catherine Murphy. Shane O'Malley.
First of all, I'd like to thank Deputy Flannagan for opening up the opportunity for this debate tonight. And I'd like also to thank him for choosing the way he has done, and that is to put this down as a motion, but also to specify how he sees it rolling out from his point of view. And I think that takes some political courage to specify. And he obviously has put together a very detailed bill, which obviously will be debated in the future. Despite the fact that the production, transportation and sale of cannabis remain illegal in most countries around the world, many of those countries and some of the US states are either changing their laws or considering changing their laws around this issue. I think it's healthy to have a debate rather than burying our heads in the sand and pretending that we don't have an issue to deal with and we don't have a problem to deal with. A substantial portion of our population, somewhere in the region of 150,000 people, are either regular or occasional cannabis users. For those, there are often serious potential consequences if somebody ends up with a conviction. And essentially there can be an issue in relation to not being able to travel to particular countries. There can be an issue in relation to getting particular types of employment, and I think that is obviously a very serious issue for some, and it's a life-changing issue for some. It's also, I think, something worth considering that for those who have been adversely affected by cannabis, very often it isn't open to them to reveal that they have had adverse reactions by virtue of the fact that it is an illegal substance. So I think that there is a potential to actually confront the issue for some people that they don't feel can be confronted at the moment. There's no doubt that the war on drugs has been lost, and only a fraction of the drugs that are seized, account for the amount of drugs that are available in this country. And I think the figure that has been widely talked about is somewhere in the region of 10%. We also now know there's a serious problem with organised crime. And that was initially centred around the drugs industry, if you call it that, but it was centred around Dublin City initially. And by virtue of the fact that it wasn't tackled aggressively enough at that point, obviously it is an issue now for every town and city in this country. If the financial benefit is removed, it's worth asking ourselves the question, what would the result be? And I think it's worthwhile exploring that. In relation to cannabis, in recent years, we've seen routine seizures of commercial quantities produced in grow houses. Well, it's only in the last 5 or 6 years this has been a feature. And usually it ends up with somebody who is fairly poverty-stricken, doing this in awful conditions. And they're the ones that end up being the ones that end up being prosecuted, but it's others who end up with the financial gain from that type of aspect of this particular. They're the beneficiaries of this illegal trade. Looking back on prohibition, and it's been mentioned both last night and tonight, in the United States in the 1920s, it didn't work. In that alcohol was produced, and very often it was pretty dangerous what was produced. But it also allowed the mafia to gain a stranglehold, and that grip still remains today. With a 2020 vision, it's great. It's a great thing, but it's difficult to see anything positive that came out of prohibition. However, what we can do is learn from a failed policy that left a very dangerous legacy. Deputy Flannagan has perhaps surprised nobody by bringing this private member's motion forward, and indeed producing legislation as well. And indeed, he's put considerable work into producing a bill that would outline how he sees this should be done. But what he has done is, by putting it forward in this way, he's ensured that this opens up the debate, starts the debate, but doesn't conclude it. I, for one, would welcome an opportunity to fully explore the implications of what is contained in the bill, would like to do so in a calm, thoughtful and considered way over a period of time. Deputy Flannagan's views on the legalisation of cannabis may be more mainstream today when they were some years ago when he first began raising the subject. His approach is shared, though, today by people like the Chief Constable of Durham, Mike Barton, who went considerably further in calling for the decriminalisation of Class A drugs. He said prohibition had put billions of pounds into the hands of criminals. He was not denying that drugs did harm. He was arguing that prohibition didn't work. He called for an open debate on the problems caused by drugs, and I would like that open debate in a calm and measured way. Like the amendment that's tabled by government tonight, the Home Office responded in the same way to the Chief Constable. I'm not going to go into the time of my colleagues here, so I just would welcome some of the. I won't go. I'd just like to acknowledge some of the contributions from the other side of the House, from the like of Deputy Dowds, Deputy McNamara, and indeed Deputy Coyne. I think that it's time that we did allow a time for an open debate, and I think that what was suggested about maybe putting 12 months aside, looking at it in a thoughtful way, would be a better way of approaching this.
Thank you. Call Deputy Joan Collins. 6 minutes.
I welcome the opportunity to debate this issue and what is a very complex question. Even though the bill will be voted down, there's a need for an ongoing informed debate on the issues, and I commend Deputy Flannagan for introducing this motion into the chamber. The drug problem in our society is not a question of just cannabis use. It is the estimated 20,000 heroin addicts in the country. It is the 10,000 people in so-called treatment using methadone, while there are only 38 detox beds in the whole country. It is the existence of criminal gangs who are terrorising families and working class communities with threatening demands for payment of so-called debts. We've seen that in our own community only too well. I was just dealing with a woman the other day who sold a house in 2007 with her husband and obviously got some money out of that. The drug gangs knew about it and pinpointed her and extorted €64,000 out of her. That's the type of thing that's going on in our communities and has to stop. There's the horror of this dismembered body in the waste ground in West Dublin. That's what this issue is about. A recent statement by Kofi Annan and others from the Global Commission on Drugs Policy are calling for new thinking and declaring the war on drugs a failure is to be welcomed. In its report of June 11, 2011, it specifically called for experimentation with legal regulation of drugs and especially cannabis in order to undermine organised crime. Billions have been spent by state agencies around the world every year in an attempt to contain the supply and use of illegal drugs. The reality is the target of eradication, the idea of a drug-free world as espoused by the UN in 1961, is now recognised as an impossibility. The Global Commission is arguing correctly, in my view, that the bulk of this money should be switched to spending on treatment and education, supporting farmers in countries like Peru, Colombia, Afghanistan, to actually cultivate food for the world economy rather than production for drugs. Hundreds of millions are in prison at enormous costs. These are the small fry, the addicts, the small-time dealers, the mules. They are the victims. The big drug lords, protected by huge wealth and their ability to threaten and corrupt, don't worry about prison. They worry about being knocked off by their rivals. We need to reorientate policy to treat addicts, using those who support the habit by involvement as small-time players in the drug business. This does not mean a liberal or softly approach to organised crime. We need a targeted and sophisticated approach to breaking up the gangs and putting the big players behind bars. I want to give another example of Dublin South Central. There, about a year and a half ago, was raised in the community, particularly among the active communities, organisations that deal with families and young people in drugs. And there was an increase in the crime and in the manner of which these people were walking around and strutting around the area. And we called in our community for a response, and the guards did reply to it. They set up Operation Trident, which is a very successful operation where they went underground, got involved in the community, and was it was in the papers afterwards what they'd done, and they infiltrated the gangs. And they have picked out and they managed to target these 20 or more of those people who are involved integrally in the area, and it was a very good action that should be done right across the country. We know who's doing this. We know the people in our streets and in our communities who are using drugs to impoverish people in our communities and make lots of money for themselves. And I believe this motion is raising some of these issues. On the issue of legalisation of cannabis and other drugs, I have an open mind. I've made contact with the Dublin Citywide and Addiction Response Crumlin, organisations that provide key service supports for drug use and their families. While supporting decriminalisation, they do not support the legislation, and I think we have to ask the question why. I don't think they have the confidence that the drug gangs will be tackled. They don't have confidence that there's going to be the treatment centres and the support that's needed there. They don't have the confidence that there's enough support in their mental services. They don't have the confidence that it'll be brought in properly legislation that's been proposed. And what they see, the key to them, the debate must go on, is the decriminalisation of users, and they are found with small amounts of drugs, and they should not be jailed. They should not have convictions. They should not have it on their record. They should be linked in with community programmes to assist them if they want to come out of the drug habit and criminal activity. My own view is that I would support legalisation of cannabis. As been pointed out, the reality is that 7% of our population use it. that's not going to go away. It's going to continue, and possibly other drugs, but as part of an overall policy which emphasises treatment, education, and a targeted, well-resourced crackdown on organised crime. I also believe this problem cannot be solved in a single country. It requires a new international policy to deal with the issue. Again, I welcome the idea of a serious debate on the issues in relation to decriminalisation, use of medicine in relation to people who need it, and it's been proven that it's effective. And in that regard, I'm extremely disappointed in the government's extremely conservative, lazy response on their amendment, which even doesn't even try to address some of those issues or develop some of those issues that have been raised here in the Dáil over the last 2 nights. I actually just want to finish off on one point. International capitalism dictates the price of food, dictates the price of sugar, dictates the price of what poor countries can sell their food in the markets to other countries. If that continues, people in these countries are going to be forced to start producing drugs and cannabis and other drugs because they've no other choice. It's the only way they're going to raise money. So that's why I'm a socialist, and I think there needs to be a planned economy and a planned way of actually producing our goods, producing our food, and linking that all over the world. And it also jars me very much as well when I hear about people talking about mental health and the effects of drugs on that and cannabis and everything else.
Thank you,
I agree that could be the case. But this austerity is causing more grief and mental health in our communities than anything that could be related to cannabis use.
Thanks very much. First of all, there has been some criticism levelled at the technical group for facilitating Deputy Flannagan and bringing forward this motion. By the way, it's not a bill, it's a private member's motion. And to that criticism, I want to say that just what they call democracy exists within the technical group, which allows every individual to speak his mind on any issue in the Dáil. That's not the case in some parties. If I could refer to the abortion bill, where because of a conscientious view of some people, they were forced to leave the party. So I just want to make that clear, that in spite of the fact that some people within the group may not support the bill, I'm not too sure, that he has every right to bring this bill forward. I welcome the debate. I think it's a valuable debate and worthwhile on the basis that the illegal drugs trade at present is a massive global industry, highly sophisticated international supply chain, and according to the United Nations, the illegal drugs trade makes up a staggering 8% of world trade. It's worth more than the combined global market of textiles, clothing, iron and steel. And the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated the value of the global illicit drug market is now running into hundreds of billions. Nearly 300 million people are using drugs worldwide: cannabis, marijuana, hashish, THC. So it's something that we can't avoid. I was interested in the contribution the Deputy Kine made. I think it was a very constructive contribution. I apologise, Deputy Connolly. So, like, this debate is valuable. The most serious criminal activity in the past decades in Ireland has been terrorism and drugs. And while right now there's a very small, tiny minority involved in terrorism, that drug dealing and drug taking has escalated beyond every city in Ireland into every small town and every village. And this can't be denied. I just is interesting that on my Facebook and on my webpage, that when this debate came up, that I received hundreds, I think it was nearly 800 messages. Funnily enough, they were running 60-40 opposing legalisation, but a healthy 40% were in favour of decriminalisation and legalisation. I have a letter here from a woman. I don't know about that. That might be a question I might put out. It's interesting that I received 2 letters, just very briefly. I know I don't have much time on it, and I think we could do with a lot more time in debating this, and maybe when the bill is put forward, you'll have a lot more time. Dear John, I'm at the end of my tether. I'm only fit to throw myself in the river. I honestly need your compassion and cooperation when you read this letter. Please let me explain my position to your good self. My son is a helpless addict who over the past few months has been trying to kick the despicable habit. But in the interim, myself and my family are at our wits' end and are really suffering because of the terrible affliction. Today I got a phone call from a mother. Her 25-year-old son has gone missing since Saturday. He took some cocaine about a year back, and it was bad cocaine, and he suffered some schizophrenia, and she's panicking, and I'm hoping to meet the family on Friday. But these are two ordinary people. I suppose this can be replicated throughout the country, who have serious problems, and they haven't made a comment to me in this debate as to whether it should be legalised or criminalised. They just want something done, and that's the issue. I do feel that, and I have made a point of speaking to as many people as I can, particularly in the southeast, and the vast majority of them have told me that they would be against legalisation. I myself am not against decriminalising cannabis. I think there's 150,000 people with a criminal record smoking a joint, which prohibits them from leaving the country, but also the criminal record stays with them. So I think we should really look at that, decriminalising it. My problem is this, that we tend to go to excess in Ireland, and if you look at the situation with the excessive alcohol abuse, particularly with young kids, and when I say young kids, I mean young kids, below the 18 years of age, and of course 18 years and up where you can get it legally. My worry would be if we were to legalise cannabis and make that available, that associated combined problems of we dealing with stuff in excess in this country, I think, would be catastrophic. For that very reason, I can't support the legalisation aspect of this motion. I would most certainly be prepared to listen to a number of people over the next couple of months, which I plan to do. I've agreed to meet the Chief Superintendent from the British Police. I have to ring him tonight, actually. I think he might be in the gallery, actually, so I'm hoping to meet him tomorrow. He'll give me his view on what happens in England. I know that the UK are currently doing a big rethink on their drugs policy, which may lead to cannabis and other drugs being legalised in the UK, I don't know. But I wanted to conclude by saying that this is a very worthwhile debate and a very worthwhile motion. It's something that we can't avoid with the excessive use of illegal drugs and legal drugs in Ireland, that we really, and I would hope that at some stage that maybe if Deputy Flannagan introduces his bill, that the government would allow a lot more time to debate this, because I think it's a worthwhile debate that will be watched by families all over this country.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you.
Margaret, you now call the Minister for Health, Dr. James Riley.
Thank you very much, Councillor Corla, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak on this motion tonight, and I accept fully it's a motion, not a bill, but there is a bill in the offing too. And Deputy Flannagan, as you quite rightly say, like every other member of this House, has every right to raise issues that concern him, and I have absolutely no issue with that. I do, however, have an issue with his attempt to have cannabis legalised, the cultivation and sale and possession to be legalised and regulated, because there are serious health risks with cannabis, notwithstanding what some people would try and have you believe. There's studies from Sweden and from New Zealand showing acute schiziform illness being precipitated by the use of cannabis. I know that there's a contention on behalf of Deputy Flannagan that there is no demonstrable rise in the incidence of schizophrenia, even though there was a rise in the use of cannabis. But the rise in schizophrenia one might expect to be attributed would be only 0.08%. Sorry, 0.8%, not 0.8%, which would be very difficult to demonstrate in an epidemiological study. So I know that equally, of course, most people who use cannabis smoke it, and I'm vehemently opposed to smoking, and I know, as everyone in this House knows, the damage that smoking does, including causing cancer. And of course, people inhale quite deeply this substance, usually mixed with tobacco. That's not saying that that's the only mode of use. And of course, there is a medicinal use for cannabis, and that there are proprietary preparations available. And myself and Minister White are looking at that with a view to making that available to those who need it from a medicinal point of view. But the idea of legalising cannabis, I'm afraid, is not something that we agree with, given that there are serious concerns around its impact on health. And I think, as Deputy Halligan has just stated, it's also well accepted to be a gateway drug to the use of other more seriously damaging drugs. It has also been said that cannabis has not been responsible for a single death. And while deaths due to cannabis alone are rare, data from the National Drugs-Related Death Index showed that in 2010, the most recent year available, there were 72 deaths where the individual had a positive post-mortem toxicology for cannabis. Now, I'm not saying that in all these incidents cannabis was the cause of death, not by a long shot, but clearly, there are question marks. And furthermore, Professor Joseph Harbison recently told the Dublin Coroner's Court that doctors at St. James's Hospital had seen cases of young people having strokes following the use of herbal cannabis in the past 3 years. This phenomenon was linked to the use of high-potency cannabis. With regard to the attitudes among Irish population to cannabis use, we have not recorded any significant public support for changing our current approach to cannabis. For example, in the 2010-2011 drug prevalence survey, it found that while most respondents agreed with cannabis use being permitted for medical reasons, such as Minister White mentioned last, as I've said, is the policy direction being pursued at my department. Almost 70% of the respondents disagreed with cannabis use being permitted for recreational purposes. Equally, the development of our national drug strategy 2009-2016, which involved a very comprehensive public consultation process, no evidence of any significant public support for a change in cannabis policy was identified. So any suggestion that the legalisation of cannabis will result in there no longer being an illegal market in cannabis or that organised crime will simply withdraw from the cannabis market is to ignore the experience gleaned in the regulation of other legal markets. And all we have to look at is the tobacco industry and the amount of illegal smuggling goes on, and terrorism and those associated with terrorism in the past have been found to be associated with this particular area of illegal activity. I have a very firm view. I want to see more enforcement. It's an enforcement issue, and we need more enforcement. With clear view, not clouded by cannabis, I can tell you. So, with regard to concerns raised regarding the recording of convictions, the question of explaining criminal records is a matter that has already been examined by the House in the context of the Criminal Justice Spent Convictions Bill in 2012. And my colleague, Minister for Justice, Alan Chatter, updated the House on these matters only yesterday during parliamentary questions. So I'd like to re-emphasise the government's commitment to the continued implementation of the National Drugs Strategy to tackle the drugs issue in a comprehensive way. The government is very focused on ensuring there is an increased emphasis on moving people from drug treatment to an addiction-free life where this is achievable. In short, we must present people with the opportunities to achieve a life without addiction. And I do actually share Deputy Collins' concern about the use and duration of use of methadone in this country, and we're examining how to encourage people and incentivize people to come off methadone.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Now the last speaking slot shared by Deputies Nick Wallace and Luke Flannagan. Deputy Wallace.
Thank you. The argument has changed on cannabis regulation. Ecuador has decriminalised the drug. Uruguay has recently become the first country to introduce a legal, regulated market for cannabis, with a focus on putting drug traffickers out of business. And in the US, Colorado and Washington State have voted to legalize recreational cannabis. In August, the New York City Comptroller Office recommended cannabis legislation upon finding that taxing and regulating the substance would generate revenue of $400 million annually and would have even more significant social justice benefits. To quote the Comptroller, regulating marijuana would keep thousands of New Yorkers out of the criminal justice system, offer relief to those suffering from a wide range of painful medical conditions, and make our streets safer by sapping the dangerous underground market that targets our children. As if that weren't enough, it would also boost our bottom line. On the basis of this movement, one would be impelled to ask, why the change of approach, especially in the case of the US, who have invested more money, time and resources than anyone else on the so-called war on drugs. The reason for this shift are manifold and obvious to those with the capacity to look objectively at the issue. The first and most influential reason that a government would legalise and regulate cannabis use is that the war on drugs does not work, but is in fact an ongoing public demonstration of how to clog up the legal system and prisons, wreck the lives of individuals, families and communities, and waste taxpayers' money and police energies that would be better spent working with and for society rather than against it. In light of recent scientific research, the current classification of cannabis as a Class B drug makes no sense. That is, if we take for granted the common definition for illegal drugs, that they have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. A 2007 paper published in the prestigious peer-reviewed medical journal Lancet, with the collaboration of the UK Cabinet Office Strategic Unit in 03, produced a systematic ranking system for 20 substances. Their findings are interesting. Alcohol ranked as the 5th most dangerous and damaging drug, tobacco was the 9th, and cannabis ranked the 11th. And to think that alcohol abuse in Ireland is costing the state over $3.5 billion a year. In light of these findings, the classification of cannabis as a Class B drug, while the much more damaging alcohol and tobacco are legally available to the public, is contradictory at the least. One more reason for the serious disconnect between politicians and the people who put them in power. For centuries, it has been known that cannabis has medicinal properties. Hundreds of journal articles were written between the 1840s and the 1930s, extolling the benefits of cannabis use on nervous and convulsive disorder, for example. But since the drug was made illegal in the US in the 30s, the research has been, and still is, skewed towards investigating the negative effects of the substance instead of its benefits. Recently, there has been much coverage in the media of a particular argument surrounding the use of cannabis, namely that there's a direct link between cannabis, psychosis, and schizophrenia. The truth is that there is no consensus on the matter. In a report on the emerging evidence surrounding cannabis research, authored with the collaboration of KCA UK, the National Drug Research Institute Australia, and the National Addiction Centre in London, it was found that, to quote, the best available evidence from the existing range of prospective epidemiological studies indicates that cannabis can precipitate schizophrenia in people who are already vulnerable for individuals or family reasons, and that the relationship between cannabis and anxiety is likely to be the result of other mediating factors such as childhood and family factors. In short, any claim that there's a causal relationship between cannabis use and the creation of mental health conditions does not pay attention to the available evidence. This claim is supported by the fact that increased rates of cannabis use in the last 30 years have not been accompanied by a corresponding increase in the rates of psychosis in the population. If this government were seriously concerned about mental health, it would immediately cease its austerity programme, which is contributing to and exasperating the problem of inequality in Ireland, which is, according to a recent Oxfam report, currently 4 times that of the OECD average. Mind, the National Association for Mental Health in the UK, highlight the idea that good mental health is not something you have, but something you do. To be mentally healthy, you must value and accept yourself. This is something much more difficult in the present unequal societies. Recent World Health Organization surveys completed in 12 OECD countries, Ireland included, show that there is a direct association in rich countries between income inequality and the proportion of adults who have been mentally ill. Given these findings, for anyone on the government benches to claim to really care about those experiencing mental illness problems can be difficult to take. Legislation would replace a criminal market with a system in which supply is controlled, products regulated, and profits taxed.
1 minute remaining.
This would be safer for children, as parents would have more control than at present. Safer for users, since drugs could be tested, and safer for society, as it would cut off funding for criminal gangs that cause untold damage at present. So much money is spent every year to enforce the prohibition of marijuana, arresting and charging people with low-level marijuana possession. Against this background, we debate more cuts to social services, cuts to the disabled, single parents, and the most vulnerable in our society. The drugs war has failed abysmally. We need a drug policy that is patient-centred and fiscally responsible. We need our government to look honestly at the facts, put people first, and stop misleading the public.
Now call Deputy Luke Flannagan.
Thank you, Chairman. The first thing I want to say is I'm disappointed that the direct line minister for this issue couldn't be here. He criticised me in my speech for not dealing with the health effects of using cannabis. Now, I'm sure he would have been aware that my speech was broken up into 2 parts, and this evening I will be discussing this issue. But sadly, for this very serious issue, he can't be bothered to be here. I will send him on a YouTube clip. So he was here for the first hour, but he criticised me for not including the health effects, and he's not here to listen to it. That is the fact. The first thing I want to do is thank Deputy Robert Dowds, and also, and in particular, to thank Deputy Paul Connaughton for making what was the bravest statement I have heard on this yet. Because I can stand up here and I can propose this. I'm not in government, and I wouldn't face as much criticism, but potentially Deputy Connaughton will. But I congratulate him for it, and I think his voters will thank him for it. I'd also like to thank Deputy Derek Keating for showing himself up for what he is. Maybe his speech here today will be covered in his local newspaper, and maybe he can deliver all those newspapers himself. And then everyone will know that he's tough on drugs. Loads of votes in that. Anyways, yesterday evening I dealt with the issue of how I don't believe it's radical anymore to talk about legalising cannabis. I also spoke about the practical steps that needed to be taken to regulate it. This evening I will talk about the myths associated with the negative health effects of using cannabis, and also the amount of money that we could get out of this for our state. Myth number 1, cannabis produces an adult amotivation syndrome. A World Health Organization report in 1998 addresses the issue and states, "It is doubtful that cannabis use produces a well-defined amotivational syndrome." Also, a survey on drug prevalence, from survey you quoted yourself, Minister, carried out by the National Advisory Committee on Drugs in 2010 and 11, found that lifetime and last year rates for usage of cannabis on the island of Ireland are highest among professionals, senior management and top civil servants, although some people would make that as an argument to ban it. The study also reveals that lifetime prevalence rates for usage were highest among those with a third-level education. Doesn't sound like it's demotivating people. The issue that cannabis causes cancer, well, that has to be the biggest joke of all time at this stage. The largest study of its kind has unexpectedly concluded that smoking cannabis, even regularly and heavily, does not lead to lung cancer. I have previously quoted studies from Dr. Donald Tashkin which suggested it was more harmful than smoking tobacco. But Dr. Tashkin has changed his mind. Unfortunately, the FDA don't seem to want him to work for them anymore now that he's discovered it isn't quite that harmful. The new findings were against our expectations, said Donald Tashkin of the University of California at Los Angeles. This should be good news, Minister. A pulmonologist who has studied cannabis for 30 years. We hypothesized that there would be a positive association between cannabis use and lung cancer, logical enough, and that the association would be more positive with heavier use. That's what he said. What we found instead was no association at all, and even a suggestion of some protective effect. I have to say, I was surprised as well, because I would have argued, look, maybe smoking it isn't the ideal thing. But as it turns out, this man has now changed his mind. I suggest we invite this man to the Dáil Health Committee in order that we can debunk this myth forever, and I challenge you to do that. There's also the issue of apparently it blocks up the lungs. Now, look it. If that turns out to be the case, and if it does cause lung problems, well then maybe people should use another method of ingesting it. But calling for a ban on it on that basis is like calling for a ban on spuds, because if you turn them into chips, they become unhealthy. The problem is not the substance, it is how it is ingested that would be the problem. Another myth, cannabis supposedly causes brain damage. Fact. The brain damage argument is based on what is called the Dr. Heath Trelane study. In this study, rhesus monkeys were strapped into a chair and then strapped into gas masks and given the equivalent of 63 Colombian-strength joints in 5 minutes, losing no smoke. As a result of, always gets a laugh, as a result of smoking this cannabis, the monkeys ended up with brain damage. What the study remarkably ignores is that the monkeys' brains are in fact damaged by oxygen deprivation and not by cannabis. You've changed your view since you begged me for a vote in the Senate, Deputy. A subsequent study of... Can I have a bit of order, please? A subsequent study of 1,318 people was carried out over a 15-year period at the highly reputable Johns Hopkins University, you're familiar with it, in Baltimore. Researchers reported no significant differences in cognitive decline between heavy users, light users, and non-users of cannabis. Now, this is the Johns Hopkins University, not the Let's All Have a Party University. It is quite reputable. I'm sure you'll agree. Now, the issue of cannabis being a gateway drug is the myth that never seems to go away. Well, we'll work on it here. The Institute of Medicine in Washington, D.C. issued a report on the various aspects of cannabis, including the so-called gateway theory. The Institute of Medicine stated there is no conclusive evidence that the drug effects of cannabis are causally linked to the subsequent abuse of other illicit drugs. Also, the Netherlands Institute of Mental Health has stated that, as for a possible switch from cannabis to hard drugs, it is clear that the pharmacological properties of cannabis are irrelevant in that respect. It is also worth noting that in the Netherlands, where one can openly purchase cannabis, the lifetime usage rates for cocaine is 1.9%, whereas the figure for the United States of America, where up until 2 years ago had some of the most penal sanctions on the planet for using cannabis, the amount of people in their lifetime who had tried cocaine there was 16.2%. So it seems the Dutch system makes it 7 to 8 times less likely that you'll go on to use an exceptionally destructive drug like cocaine. Good news, you'd imagine. Cannabis causes psychosis and schizophrenia, we are told. Now, that was a new one that came out when all the other arguments were bet. It was the latest reefer madness argument. In 2009, a study led by Dr. Martin Fisher, invite him to the committee as well, of Keele University, examined the records of 600,000 patients aged between 16 and 44, but failed to find a similar link.
1 minute.
According to the study, cannabis use in the UK between 1972 and 2002 has increased 4-fold in the general population and 18-fold among under 18s. Based on the literature supporting a link, which he keeps going on about, one would have to argue that this increase in usage should have been followed by an increase in schizophrenia of 29% between 1990 and 2010. But what did happen? Researchers found no increase in the diagnosis of schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders during that period. In fact, some of the data suggested the incidence of these conditions had decreased. Now, very importantly, in the last 2 weeks, the head of Schizophrenia Ireland, John Saunders, said quite clearly it does not cause schizophrenia. But at the same time, he would advise people who had schizophrenia to stay away from it. So would I, and alcohol, and Red Bull, and a variety of other things. But I wouldn't turn them into criminals because of it. This study does not therefore support the scientific causal link between cannabis use and the incidence of psychotic disorders. This concurs with other reports indicating that increases in population cannabis use have not been followed by increases in psychotic incidences. Now, I'll finish by giving you the argument as to why it should be legalized for financial reasons. One of the major ones is this. According to Professor David Nutt, who today won the 2013 John Maddox Prize for Standing Up to Science, he estimates that alcohol use in this country would drop by 25% if cannabis was legalized. As the minister knows, it costs this country $3.4 billion every year in damage. If we reduced our alcohol usage, inevitably we would save money. 100,000 people with a criminal record would all be freed up to increase their economic activity if cannabis was legalized. Because currently, these people are prohibited in working in any decent job. Even a €1,000 increase would be worth €100 million to the economy. I just have 2 more things to say. 150,000 currently, it is estimated, use this substance. If they paid tax And if they were to spend €100 per month and pay 33% tax on that, it would be worth 60 million to the economy. The cost of the judicial system and the Gardaí of arresting 8,000 people a year would be gone. A study in Israel estimates that it would be worth $450 million to their economy if it was legalized. It would not be an exaggeration to say it would be similar here. I will finish now, and I propose that you vote for this motion because it is going to be a wonderful thing for the country.
I now put the question on amendment number 1 in the name of the Minister for Health. The question is that the amendment be made. Chakti Tarhiv the Kesh Jabajista. The Chakti and the Gunyabaj Neil. Shilm Gurun Kesh Rich. My opinion, the question is carried. Vote on.